and fell through time. That's rather important. And with that he opened the door and left the room, leaving Ned staring after him in shock. Kevan. The further north they sailed up that wretched river, the more unsettled he became at what he was seeing all around them. The Gloud at the river ahead of them. The Wolf's River some called it around here, whilst further south it was called Wolf's Spear. Bloody northerners. Why couldn't they give a river a single bloody name and stick with it? He looked back at the east side of the river and the activity there that was still unsettling him. Everywhere he looked he could see activity of some sort. People were lopping trees down, ploughing, sowing, reaping, building, preparing. He could see a cart over to one side that had stone stacked in it, stone that was being used to help repair a stone wall that divided two fields. And in the distance a windmill was being repaired as another one on the horizon worked steadily, its sails rotating in the wind. The north was preparing for winter. Preparing for the kind of winter that came once in 1,000 years. And more than that, they were preparing for war at the same time. War with what winter would bring. He shuddered for a moment and then he sighed and returned to his cabin. The 5 ships were just about all right on this river. There was just enough room to tack up them, and once in a while the wind was from the south enough to let them shake out a reef and fly up it northeast. He was not much of a sailor, but even he knew that they were making damn good time. The lack of iron-borne ships, thanks to the civil war that they were fighting that amused Tywine so very much, had been a surprise. What had also been a surprise had been the sheer number of ships heading north. Ships from the Reach, from Dawn and, yes, from the Westerlands. One of those ships was owned and commanded by Goran Westerling, Lord of the Crag, and the head of an old and proud family, and that ship now followed them, after orders from Tywine that Lord Westerling provide him as much information as possible as to what was happening at the wall. According to Westerling, his son Reynold had gone to the wall earlier that year with a small group of men in answer to the call, and what he had seen there had so unsettled him that he had sent an immediate message back to his father. Something about wildlings fleeing south, chased by something worse than the stranger. Something about whites. About heads in cages. Someone shouted on deck, something about the lake being ahead, and he stirred himself, pulling on his jerkin and walking up on deck. Yes, they had reached the lake that was the origin of the river. The Northmen here had a very original name for it, the lake. But that lake led to Torrens Square, the home of House Tallheart and the start of a road that led straight to Winterfell. All 5 ships set all sails and used every scrap of wind to beat their way up the lake. That was a good idea. Kevan had a bad feeling that something was in the air. There had been something about the way that people had been pointing at their banners the past day and a half, as if they were uneasy about them, or certainly unsettled. By the time that the sun was starting to set they were all tied up at the wharves and jetties of Torrens Square, small as the harbour there was. What was not small was the castle there. The walls were 30 feet tall at least and thick. A nasty place to try and take on the fly, not that such a thing was surely possible after that passage up the river. Hellman Tallheart, the master of Torrens Square and apparently the equivalent of a knight in the south, was not there to greet Tywine and the others as they disembarked. Instead there was his young and at first rather flustered wife, Gemma Tallheart, who, unless he was mistaken, had formerly been of House Caswell in the Reach. Pregnant too, given the slight swell of her stomach. Very interesting. However surprised she might have been, Gemma Tallheart soon settled down, had her steward bring bread, salt and wine for her guests, apologized for her husband, who was apparently off dealing with a minor dispute between 2 sets of small folk about new grain, or some such nonsense, and then offered Tywine guests quarters in Torrens Square itself. Tywine had, of course, accepted as graciously as he was able to, with a slight bow and a quirk of the lips that was not quite a smile, and then had retired to his room and started to snap out orders about the journey to Winterfell. Tell Westerling to send word to his eldest son as soon as possible, Tywine started off. I want as much information as possible as to what is happening with regard to that. And then, Kevan, find out what has happened about Baratheon and his arrival at Winterfell. I'm sure that a small flock of ravens are on their way to me from Cersei about the way that she claims she has been mistreated, or about what Baratheon has been doing. There were some odd reports from King's Landing before they left, something about the king becoming far more active. I want to hear the latest information. I detest sea travel at times, it makes it hard to know what is happening. Knuckles rapped on the door and they both turned. Come. Tywine barked, and the door opened to reveal Lord Westerling in company with a pale maester who was clutching a message that looked as if it had been carried by a raven. What is it? Westerling strode in, looking grim to say the very least. News has arrived from Winterfell. It came 2 days ago. Lord Lannister, you must prepare yourself for bad news. Kevan stood at the same instant as Tywine, as dread roiled through him. What news? Tywine barked, and the maester handed over the scroll with a shaking hand. Fell news, my lord, the man said, and then he fled, closing the door behind him. There was a pause, and then Tywine unrolled the message and his eyes flickered over the words. And then he froze in place, his eyes unmoving and his chest barely moving. After a long and terrible moment, blood seemed to suffuse his face, as a look of the utmost rage spread over his visage, before he scowled, controlled his expression and then bent over the message again. Westerling, he muttered after another moment. You know what this says? I do. How far has this message spread? Lord Westerling winced a little and then sighed. A long way. I would be surprised if King's Landing does not know this by now. Another ripple of rage crossed Tywine's face, before being quashed rapidly. Very well. Leave us. Now. Westerling nodded and then all but fled the room. As he did so, Tywine held out the message for Kevan. Read it. Deeply confused, but filled with dread, he reached out and took the message. It read, King Robert, the first of his name, has divorced Cersei Lannister on charges of treason, incest and adultery, in that she was discovered fornicating with her own brother, Sir Jaime Lannister. This was witnessed by Lord Eddard Stark, the Hand of the King, Lord Baratheon and Sir Barristan Selmy. Both arrested. For a long moment he stared at the message. This was madness. It made no sense whatsoever. Cersei would never do anything as insane, as disgusting. No. It was impossible. This is madness, he said eventually. No. Beyond impossible. Brother, say the word and I will set sail today for Casterly Rock to call the banners. This is an insult. But instead of agreeing, Tywine just stood there, staring at the fire, his eyes almost as ablaze as the grate. And then he finally passed a hand that shook a little over his eyes. No, he said eventually. We will go to Winterfell and ascertain the truth of this. Utterly bewildered, he looked at his brother. I don't understand. This is revolting. It has to be a mistake. Cersei and Jaime would never do something as revolting as that. Incest. Treason. Never. There was another pause. Did you read the list of witnesses? Oh. He looked again. And then he blanched. Stark, Stannis Baratheon and Selmy. He paused. They are not men known for lying. Just the opposite, in fact. Oh gods. Tywine, this is bad. But why? His brother interrupted him. All men with ridiculous standards of honor and other things. Not liars. Never liars. Tywine said the last word slowly. And then there is the thing that I sent Westerling out of the room for. This was bewildering. Which was? Just before Tyrion was born. Joanna came to me. Said that she had ordered that our twins be separated into rooms on the opposite sides of the rock. That they were too close. He froze in place. No. Not that. She said that they'd been found being intimate. Tywine, surely they were too young for that. That is what I thought too. Foolish perhaps, but too young to know. More fury on his face, leavened with something else. Uncertainty. After Joanna died, Cersei begged to have her old room back. Next to Jaime. Begged me with tears in her eyes. There was a long pause as Kevan thought through the horrifying implications. But then, what are we to do? Tywine's face worked again, as rage, incomprehension and indecision all wrought within him, and Kevan had the sensation of being present at a battle that came down to a decision balanced on the blade of a knife. We go to Winterfell, his brother said eventually, in a hoarse voice that spoke of something close to desperation. We go to Winterfell and we find out the truth about this. Kevan stared at his brother for a long moment. What if this is false news? Tywine stirred slightly. Then we will call the banners and raise the north from the neck to the wall. He nodded. But there was still a question that had to be asked. And what if this is true? But Tywine merely hunched his shoulders and shook his head for an instant. As Kevan left the room, his brother was still standing there, staring out of the window. Staring north. Robb. I wish I had a Valyrian steel sword, Theon griped as he looked at the remains of the training dummy that Robb had just decapitated. It would make life a lot easier. I wouldn't say that, Robb panted as he hefted ice in both hands. Yes, the blade was far lighter than anything else that size that was made with normal steel, but after a while the effort did have an impact. You need to rethink how hard you should swing the damn thing. I'm having to re-evaluate every bloody thing, every time I fight anyone. Or anything. You're right, Jon groaned as he looked at the remains of his own training dummy. I'm having to restrain myself. If I put the full force I'm normally used to into my blows, I'd spend half my time staggering whenever I bloody fight. Theon raised an eyebrow and then shrugged. Well now, if I'm to found a new house here in the north, I'd better try and earn a Valyrian steel sword from somewhere. I can't exactly inherit one. Earn one? Robb asked. They're rare enough as it is. I know, Theon replied slightly forlornly. Well, you never know. Enough bizarre things have happened that I might stumble across one of the lost ones. Jon coughed in a meaningful manner and Theon's eyes widened for a moment as he realized what he'd said. Dark Sister was still a secret, and those who had noticed the blade had been told that it had been a gift. Which was true, but they were all doing their best to deflect any such questions. They shut up and concentrated on more practice after that. A new pair of practice dummies were brought out, and after a while they too were in pieces. As he picked up a piece of one of the arms, Robb suddenly noticed that Father was standing to one side, watching them. And he had an odd look on his face. Are you all right, Father? Jon asked, looking at him seriously. Yes and no, Father replied as he walked towards them and then looked around carefully. This is not a conversation for idle ears. They all looked about, but there was no one nearby, with the exception of a trio of small direwolves and the larger shape of their mother, who sniffed the air and then looked at Father with an air of utter unconcern. Firstly, Tyrion Lannister has asked if he can marry Daisy. I am minded to allow the match, as your cousin has already told me that she wants to marry him. I think that they would be good for each other. And there must always be a Surestone in Surestone. Robb pulled a slight face but then nodded. Very well. What has disturbed you though? Father coughed slightly and then grimaced. At the end of our conversation, as he was leaving, he said that he and I need to talk about how you died and fell through time. 3 sets of eyes turned to Father at once. Robb said eventually. He must have finally worked it out. Mance Rayder did say that a child of the forest told him that he had to go to the Night Fort with the man with the golden mind and the boy who died and fell through time. Tyrion's not stupid. Eventually someone would have worked it out. Interesting that he mentioned it after talking to you about Daisy, Jon said thoughtfully. Not before. Yes, that was interesting, and Robb scratched his chin in thought. I can talk to him if you like, Father. He knows that much. And with his father coming, well, we need to avoid any chance of people jumping to conclusions, especially if they don't have enough information. We need to know what Tyrion will tell his father. We need the Westerlands, Father. Father looked at him, before eventually nodding. Very well. Talk to Tyrion. Be cautious. He laid a hand on his shoulder. You know the stakes. Especially with Lannisters. Tyrion is not like his faithless brother or sister, but he is still a Lannister. I won't let you down, Father, he said. I'll need to talk to him today. Father nodded and then strode off. Robb sighed a little as he watched him and then hefted ice before walking over to where it scabbard and slid it in. Then he smiled at the others. I'll be careful, he grinned, noting their looks of exasperated patience. I can be diplomatic, you do know that, don't you? Jon just raised his eyebrows at him, whilst Theon smiled and shrugged a little. Robb laughed and strode off to his room, Grey Wind going on ahead of him like a small furry guardian. The little direwolf was growing fast, but he was still quite small compared to the Grey Wind of his memories. He also seemed to be sniffing something in the wind, because twice he stopped and paused, furry nostrils quivering. Robb looked about at both times, but there was no one there. Odd. He shrugged and strode into his rooms, where he hung ice onto the hook by the door. It still felt odd to have it for himself. He looked at the sword for a long moment as he stood by the bed and scratched grey wind just behind his ears. He often wondered just what had happened to ice in that other world. It had vanished in King's Landing, lost in the catastrophe that had overtaken Father's forces when Cersei Bloody Lannister had moved against him. He shrugged internally. Things were very different now. He moved to the doorway and then looked back. Grey Wind was still sitting on the bed, his head tilted almost quizzically, and then he stiffened and started to growl. Danger! Robb heard the warning from the direwolf, danger! Alarmed, he looked around and then, sensing something that he couldn't describe, he leapt back as a knife swished through where he had been standing. A boot connected with the door, which slammed in the face of an approaching Grey Wind, who was snarling. As Robb recovered his balance, he finally caught sight of his attacker. It was that brat Joffrey. He looked unkempt and unshaven, he was dressed in a stained doublet and he was weaving more than a bit. He stank of stale wine, and Robb realized with a sinking heart that the brat was drunk. He was also holding a dagger that looked extremely sharp. Stinkin' wolf boy, Joffrey slurred. Stark bastard. Why our father ruined my life. M.A. Prince. Gian father will reward me for killing you and presenting him with your head. I'll be a prince again. The bastard was drunk and mad. Robb slapped at his belt for his knife, which was, of course, on the other side of the door, behind which Grey Wind was howling and clawing at the door. I need to get this fool out of the bloody way, he thought desperately. Joffrey swung again, with a wildness that made his eyebrows go up, and Robb danced back. Another swing, with a wobble in the middle, and Robb repressed a curse as the knife sliced through his doublet as if it was made of paper and nicked his arm. Valyrian steel. The bastard had a knife made from Valyrian steel, and there was something about it that looked familiar. Another swing, another dance back, but this time Joffrey stumbled slightly, off balance, and Robb backhanded him about the head with a vicious blow that the Great John had taught him before Oxcross. It seemed to stun Joffrey, who ran his spare hand over his face and then stared at the blood from his bleeding nose. I'll kill you for that, he blustered, but there was something in his voice that spoke of rising fear. Kill you? Robb, catch! Someone shouted the words, and he quickly looked around and then caught the scabbarded knife that had been thrown in his direction. In the blink of an eye the scabbard was on the floor, and he turned on Joffrey with fire in his eyes. Drop the knife, he spat. The name was a mistake. Joffrey quivered with rage and then leapt at him again. This time Robb was ready. He dodged the blow and then stepped in and grabbed his attacker's knife hand with his left as he stabbed with his right. A wide-eyed Joffrey barely caught his arm in time. His knife left a red line on the bastard's wrist, and then they stood there quivering with exertion. Joffrey opened his mouth to say something, but Robb acted first. He heaved Joffrey's knife hand around so that it smashed into the wall, and then at the same time he head-butted the drunken fool full in the face. The collision left him seeing stars, but he was ready for it. Joffrey was not. There was a crunching noise as his nose broke and he reeled back from Robb, the knife clattering to the floor as he brought both hands to his face and wailed in agony through a broken nose. Robb kicked the knife away to one side and then stepped forwards, but someone else got there first. A booted foot lashed out from behind him and crunched into Joffrey's crotch. There was a moment of utter red-faced stillness, and then Joffrey made a noise that reminded Robb of the time when he had heard a pig being butchered by a novice butcher, before collapsing in a sobbing, blood-stained heap. He bared his teeth and restrained the impulse to cut the little bastard's throat. Instead he stepped backwards and looked at his helper before blinking. Val was standing there. She had a dagger in each hand and she looked angrier than he had ever seen her before. This little prick deserved that, she spat, before looking at him. Should we kill him? Joffrey made an inarticulate noise of further distress, and Robb looked down in disgust as a certain smell came from the sobbing form on the ground. Gods! They'd have to scrub that spot. Boots thundered in the hallways as guards and others approached at a run, drawn by the noise. Grey Wind was also howling in protest, and Robb sighed and opened the door for the direwolf, who darted out and then snarled at Joffrey, before sniffing the air and then backing away, his hackles rising. What in the name of the old gods is going on here? Father did not bellow the words, but the way that he spoke commanded instant silence. He looked at Robb. You're bleeding. Robb looked down at his arm. It's just a scratch, father. The words I've had worse hung in his head for an instant, until he bit them back. Father sniffed the air and then looked in disgust at the sobbing Joffrey on the floor. Best not take any chances. Have the maester clean it. And someone take this idiot to a cell. I thought that he was confined to his room. A roaring noise boomed down the hallway and every man and woman with a weapon made ready to fight. After a long, tense moment the figure of Sandor Clegane appeared. He was staggering from wall to wall and the side of his head was covered in blood. Where is that little bastard? Father looked at him, his eyebrows raised, before pointing at the human puddle on the floor. He attacked my son, Clegane. He hit me on the fucking head with a bottle. Little shit's drunk. Clegane seemed to finally think about what else had happened and then he threw his back and laughed. The little shit attacked your son. Only one sentence for that. Well, two. Let me be there when you take his head off, Stark. Then he clutched at his head. Gods, my head hurts. As two guards picked up a keening Joffrey and Clegane staggered off again, Robb reached down, picked up the dagger that the bastard had used to attack him with. It was familiar. Very familiar. He looked at Father and then at Val, who were both watching him. I wonder where that little shit got a Valyrian steel dagger. Jon. He was out of breath by the time he got to Robb's room, preceded by a silent ghost. As he hurtled around the corner and approached the doorway he could see that several servants were scrubbing at the floor, and at a trail that led off the other way, and that the castles were standing guard outside. Their swords weren't drawn, but their hands were on the hilts and they looked as alert as it was possible for them to be. Robb was inside, stripped to the waist as Lewin carefully examined a shallow cut to his arm and then cleaned it with what looked like wine. Robb wasn't even wincing, even though it must have hurt. Father was standing to one side with a scowl on his face that did not bode well for Robb's attacker, whilst Lady Stark sat next to Robb. She was pale and shaking and judging from her eyes deeply, deeply angry. You're all right. Jon gasped the words when he could. Where is that little Shah? He bit the word off as he caught sight of Bran and Arya arriving. Idiot. Dragged off to a cell, Father grated. Under guard. Lewin will go to see him once he's finished cleaning Robb's wound. Apparently Mance Rayder's good sister Val kicked him quite hard in the, his eyes flickered at the two young Starks. Crotch. Jon snorted with amusement. Good. Serves that little shit right. Then he paused. Val was here. He raised an eyebrow at Robb, who shook his head. Not what you're thinking, brother. She was in the corridor. Not my room. Without her help I'd have had to face him without a knife. And given the way that he screamed, she put all she had in that kick. He sounded part bemused and part proud, and Jon looked at him and then at Father, who had an odd look on his face, one that combined amusement and exasperation. There was a noise at the door, a barked command, and then King Robert strode into the room. He looked as if he was ready to rip things limb from limb and he seemed to crackle with fury. The moment he saw Robb he stopped in his tracks and blinked. Gods, he said in a tight, perhaps overly controlled way. Then he saw the children. Ned, perhaps your youngest should be sent away. They shouldn't see this. Father sighed and then nodded. Bran, Arya, you should go. This isn't something for your eyes. The two younger Starks looked deeply affronted at this and Arya glared at the king in a way that predicted that she was about to say some words that Lady Stark was probably going to be horrified that Arya knew. Fortunately at that point Father cleared his throat. Bran, Arya. Please go to your rooms. Robb's fine. I'll talk to you later. There was a collective indrawing of breath from the two and Father quashed any words by glaring a little at them. Both pouted and then left, dragging their feet more than a bit. As they left Arya looked sidelong at Bran, a look that made Father add, and do not use your direwolves. Another sulky look and then they were gone. The king watched all this with an amused eye, but then as he looked at Robb the amusement vanished in the blink of that eye. Gods, Ned, I'm sorry. I know that he's not my blood, now at least, but I'm sorry. That little shit. That useless little shit. Not your fault, Robert. Father sighed. It seems that Joffrey did not take kindly to being proclaimed a bastard. But getting drunk and attacking your son. Gods, I'm sorry. He sighed and then peered at the wound. Doesn't look too bad. The wound looks clean, your grace, Lewin muttered with a slight smile of reassurance for Lady Stark. The knife was Valyrian steel, so it's lucky that the cut is so shallow. It could have been very nasty indeed. I'll sew it shut, Lord Robb, so you will need the juice of the poppy. Robb smiled slightly. I've had worse, he muttered. Do what you have to. Father looked at him quickly, with what might have been a warning look, but the king was too busy frowning to notice. Valyrian steel knife. What Valyrian steel knife? There was a pause as father reached for his belt and pulled out a curved knife in a scabbard, which he handed over to the king. The hulking other man took it and stared at it. But this is mine. I won it off Baelish a year or more ago. Wait, this went missing a while back. Sell me. The white-cloaked Kingsguard came in, nodding in recognition at Father and Lady Stark. Your Grace. According to Lord Robb here, Joffrey Hill attacked him with this. Look familiar. Selmy looked at the knife. That's your knife, Your Grace. When did it go missing? Some months ago, Your Grace. But Joffrey had it, you say? He peered at it. You're a lucky man, Lord Robb. This knife is wickedly sharp. I wonder how Hill got hold of it. The little shit stole it, the king said heavily. There can be no other explanation. Gods damn it, he continues to shame me. He tried to stab young Robb in the back when he was unarmed. He closed his eyes and seemed to be struggling with something. Finally his shoulders slumped and he handed the knife back to Father. I'd handle it myself, except that he's not my damn son anymore. I leave it in your hands, Ned. I'll approve whatever judgment you feel fit to administer. Even if you want his head for a spike on the gatehouse here. Father swapped a glance with the others and then nodded. Thank you, Your Grace. I'll let you know when I make a decision. The king nodded back and then stamped off, muttering something about needing a lot and then some sword practice. Father watched him go and then looked at Lewin. You'd best sew it shut as soon as you can. Aye, my lord, Lewin muttered as he unrolled his instruments and then offered Robb a small vial, which he sipped from with a grimace. Father had a word with one of the castles and the end closed the door and turned to Robb and the others. Right, now what were you all but gurning about when I arrived? Robb pointed at the knife. I've seen that knife before, Father, he said grimly. It's the knife that was used by the man who tried to kill Bran and Mother in that other time. Everyone stared at Robb, and then at the knife. You're sure? Jon barked, an instant ahead of Father. Robb nodded and then winced slightly as Lewin started to sew the wound shut. It cut Mother's fingers, almost to the bone. She had scars afterwards and Lewin said she was lucky not to lose the use of some of them. The blood, he paled. You don't forget something like that. Yes, that's the knife. Holding it in the air, Father scowled at it. The knife that Baelish said he'd lost to Tyrion Lannister, not Robert. I've had my doubts about that tale ever since you told me about it. It made no sense. But if it was another of Littlefinger's endless lies, I'd believe that. So, it was, we think now, passed on to that scoundrel by Joffrey. But why? There was a pause that was broken by Maester Lewin, who looked up from his careful sewing. My lord, I have observed the boy since he was disinherited. He is tall for his age, but more physically mature than mentally. And the mental aspect concerns me. Joffrey Hill is instinctively cruel, his brother and sister are both afraid of him, and I fear that the boy also has more than a touch of madness about him. He is inbred, Lady Stark said, slightly shakily as she looked at her fingers, obviously trying to imagine what such scars must have looked like. Madness can be the result of that. Which, of course, made Jon wince a little. There was a lot of inbreeding in his own family tree, to the point where at times it was more of a family plank. There can be only two possible sentences for him, Father rumbled after a moment. Death or the wall. Kill him, said Lady Stark instantly. He tried to kill our son, Ned. But it was Robb who objected to that. That would be too quick, Mother. Plus Tywin Lannister is coming. We can't afford to alienate him any further. He must know that his children have been discovered committing incest and that Cersei is no longer queen. By the time he gets here he will be humiliated enough. If he sees Joffrey's head looking down on him from a spike on the gateway, well, it will not go well. We need him. We need the gold of the Westerlands and the men that he commands. I loathe the bloody man, but he is a great commander. He looked at Lady Stark. Mother, I know how angry you are with Joffrey Hill, but we need to look at the bigger picture. I want him dead too, but exile to the wall will suffice for me. I doubt he'd last long there, Jon muttered. Given what we know what's approaching, being sent to the wall would be a death sentence in itself. Father hummed for a moment in thought. And then he grinned. What a shame. Daenerys. She was growing to hate the Magister's visits. They were always polite just, and most of their attention was on her dragons rather than her. They peered at the trio, asked questions about how fast they were growing and how long it would be before they started breathing fire. She knew what they wanted. Bravos in flames. The Titan, was it even still there after that mad story about it bellowing a warning? Melted down, the Sea Lord a charred corpse and the Iron Bank a looted ruin. All thanks to her. Or rather all thanks to her dragons. She wanted to be sick at times. They were holding her in a gilded cage. She lacked for nothing whatsoever, but it was still a cage. She looked at her dragons as they dozed in their cages. They were growing and she needed to find names for them soon. But what? She'd been brought books about Valyria's dragons, book after book after book, some ancient and more modern. The names of many of the dragons had been in High Valyrian, although some of the later Targaryen dragons had had some rather odd names. She was not going to name any of her dragons something like Sheepstellar. So what then? The black dragon looked like a second Balerion. Could she call him that? What about the green one? Rorigal perhaps, after Roriga, the brother she had never known. Perhaps that might not be a good idea. Roriga's actions had started the downfall of her family. She'd never name any of them after father or Viserys. The first had been a monster and the second had tried to murder her. She bit her lip for a moment. She really needed to think about this in more detail. A throat was cleared delicately behind her and she jumped a little. When she turned around she could see Lord Varys standing there, dressed in what looked like a merchant's clothes. He bowed a little in greeting. I am sorry if I startled you, my dear, but haste takes precedence over courtliness. She stared at him and then her heart sank a little. What has happened? A small smile flashed across his plump features for a moment. Always wise to assume the worst, my dear, he said. But in this case you were wise too. I have taken the liberty of ordering your maids to pack as many of your things as fast as possible. You must prepare your dragons at once. We need to flee Pentos and we must do so at once. Icy water seemed to flow down her back for a moment, but she made herself stand a little taller. What has happened? As she asked the question she walked over to the cages and covered each one with a thick cloth, making each dragon chirp a little in protest, before settling down to sleep. Varys sighed as he walked to the window and stared out at the harbor. You have met the Magisters of Pentos and doubtless you are not impressed. When Illyrio died defending you, the level of their collective intelligence took a sharp dive downwards. They have spent a great deal of time talking about how they will use you and your dragons to conquer Bravos. They have spent far less time wondering how Bravos will react to that attack. Such as a preemptive strike. He turned from the window. They are coming. An army carried on a fleet. They will be here before sunset, perhaps sooner. So we must go. She stared at him in horror. The Bravosi are coming here. For me. No, for me and my dragons. The last words were not a question. The older man nodded and there was sympathy in his eyes. I fear so. As I told you before, you are a piece on the board of the game of cities for many people. A valuable piece. A shudder of horror went through her. So I must flee. A nod. Yes. Where to? If I go to another city, will not the Bravosi follow me there? This time the smile was slightly larger. I know of a place that is safe. I will explain on the way. But we must go and go now. Which made her frown. How? There are guards downstairs on the gates and in the grounds. Ah, but many of the Unsullied here were once owned by Illyrio. In addition, he had some contingency plans, shall we say. There is a tunnel out of here, in the cellars. It leads to a place that I own. There are horses there and we need to get to a certain place on the northern walls. There's another tunnel there. She looked at him helplessly, memories of previous flights ahead of the usurper's assassins running through her head. But then she nodded tiredly. When she opened the door into the corridor she could see her maids scurrying about with boxes and clothes. They were surprisingly organized and she watched as they quickly packed her things up. Her more practical clothing was in the boxes, her prettier dresses were left behind. Which was probably a good thing. She looked at the clothes that the magisters had brought her and then sighed and joined the general exodus for the stairs downwards, with 3 guards carrying her dragon's cages. Down they went, until the windows vanished and the light came from lanterns, until they reached a doorway that Varys unlocked with a key. When the doors opened it was to a long narrow tunnel that they rushed through, the way illuminated with lanterns, until they saw another doorway ahead of them that Varys again unlocked. On the other side was a stairway that spiraled up to another door that opened into a courtyard, where there was a carriage waiting for them with horses behind it and a wagon. Before she could step towards the carriage and see to her dragons, Varys turned towards her, a cloak in his hands. "Tie your hair back and put this on. When we leave this carriage you need to lean on my arm and use this." A stick was handed to her. She stared at it all and then sighed and did as he requested before finally seeing that her dragons were carefully secured within the carriage. The packing seemed to take very little time and the next thing she knew she was in the carriage, alone with her dragons, with the blinds drawn. Varys had pulled on a hat and somehow made his face look rather different and was next to the driver. She heard a creak of gates, a snap of the whip and then the carriage lurched as they started forwards. It seemed like a long trip, that carriage drive through Pentos. There were times when they literally walked and other times when they cantered. More than a few curses were thrown at them, but from the sound of it and her eyebrows flew up more than a few times Varys cursed back just as loudly and with a lot of invention. Eventually they came to a stop. She waited in the darkness for a long moment and then the door opened slightly. "Are you ready, my lady?" Varys asked the question deferentially and she pulled the hood of her cloak over her head and picked up the walking stick. She remembered to lean against him and to use the stick as if presumably she was either old or sick. They passed through a doorway and into another courtyard. As the servants and guards thundered past her and the gates closed behind everything she looked up at Varys, who nodded. As she took the cloak off she looked at the cages with her dragons. She paused. Far off in the distance a bell was tolling. 5 strokes. A pause. 5 more strokes. Another pause. And then again. Another bell started to toll and then another, and as she stood there she heard the sound on the street outside turn to cries of alarm. She looked around, feeling the beginnings of panic stir. "Have they discovered that I'm gone?" "No," replied Varys grimly. "That's the warning bell. The city is under attack. The Bravosi are here. We must hurry, we have been lucky so far." They passed through another door that Varys had to unlock and then the party, some 25 strong now, went down a long winding staircase that eventually led to yet another gate, this one wider and older than the previous one, judging by the stonework. "An old way out of the city, built by someone long dead," Varys explained as he used a tinderbox to light a lantern. "I rediscovered it and refurbished it. It leads north out of the city, under the walls. It is long and we must hurry." It was indeed long, and as they passed down it she started to feel weary. The walls were damp in places and here and there the floor was uneven, so she had to watch where she was walking. On and on they went on that seemingly endless trek, and once she had to calm down the little black dragon, who was calling for her under the covering of his cage, until eventually she could see a light ahead. It was a lantern by a doorway. Once again Varys had a key, and as the door opened she held her hand out to shield her eyes from the daylight that was almost blinding her. They seemed to be in another courtyard, in a run-down shabby-looking manse that had yet more horses and 2 wagons in it. Once again they loaded up the chests and the cages that the guards and servants had brought with them. She fed her dragons and stroked them to reassure them, and then as she mounted the horse that Varys had brought over for her she looked at the bald man. "Lord Varys, where are we bound for?" He looked at her. "Andalos." She stared at him. "But, there's nothing in Andalos." "No one." "Nothing." A slight smile crossed his face. "Not entirely true, my dear. You will see. Now we must ride." And ride they did, once everything was stored away, down a long valley and then up a ridge that had what passed for a trail on it. As they rode she looked at Varys again. With me and my dragons gone, what will the Magisters of Pentos do? He shrugged. Sadly, as I said, after the death of Illyrio the level of their collective wisdom went down a great deal. I have no doubt that once the Bravo Sea were sighted then various Magisters went to your quarters in a vain effort to find out if your dragons had miraculously gained the ability to fly and also breathe fire overnight. He sighed. If they were sensible they surrendered quickly. If they were stupid then they fought. They continued up the ridge, which twisted a little to the west and the setting sun. It was then that she looked south at Pentos and her heart leapt into her throat for an instant. There was smoke billowing from the city, black and greasy. Smoke and flame in places. Ah, said Varys sadly. They were stupid then. Chapter 37. Chapter text. Jon Arryn. It had been a long meeting of the small council, enlivened mainly by the presence of Prince Oberyn Martell, who had been sitting at the table with his feet up on one corner of it, lounging almost offensively as he drank wine from a silver goblet. Most of the others had been astonished at the news that had come from Winterfell, with the exception of Renly, who had sat next to Jon and scowled a lot at Pycelle, who seemed to still be in denial about the whole thing. The Lord of the Stormlands would sail on the next tide to Storm's End with yet another head of a white. The old Maester had started off denying that it was impossible for the whole ghastly accusation to be even credible. Jon had merely glared at him and then pointed out who had witnessed it all. Pycelle had been thrown by this, but had then rallied and pointed out that it was possible that Lords Stark and Baratheon, as well as Sir Barristan, had somehow misinterpreted what might have been perfectly innocent horseplay. This had made everyone stare at him, and then Oberyn Martell had laughed until he was out of breath. Of course, Maester Pycelle, he eventually said mockingly, based on the latest raven from Winterfell they innocently both stripped naked and then she somehow fell onto his erect cock repeatedly. How could that possibly be misinterpreted? Pycelle had spluttered and muttered. And then he had vociferously objected to the king's disinheritance of his children, saying that this was folly, that it would weaken the crown, House Baratheon, Westeros. What reason could there be for this? The color of a bastard's hair meant for nothing, and what was this nonsense about the sound that Stormbreaker made? Magic. Magic was gone from this world and it had been Valerian, oddly enough, who had snarled the words "if magic is gone then explain the call, Grand Maester," that had shut the old fool up again. No, perhaps not old fool. Lannister loyalist more like. Jon had no doubt that the only reason why a raven would not fly to Casterly Rock as soon as this meeting was concluded was that Tywin Lannister was already on his way to Winterfell. As the meeting of the small council meandered its way to a close wherein the Seven Hells was Varys. What kind of sudden crisis was he dealing with? Jon looked at the men around the table and sighed internally. Pycelle was still distracted, Valerian was deep in thought, Merryweather was frowning and the High Septon, whose presence he had insisted on, was busy frowning and probably mentally writing a sermon on the mortal sin that was incest. As for Oberyn Martell, he was still amused and drinking from that silver goblet of his. The man had commanded the dismissal of the Lannister forces in the Red Keep with both competence and swagger, but Jon was fairly sure that he had been a bit disappointed that the Red Cloaks had been too stunned by the news from Winterfell to really object in a violent manner. They were not under arrest strictly speaking, but they were isolated in their barracks and in a day or two they would be on their way back to the Westerlands. As he looked around the table again and opened his mouth to dismiss them, the door to one side boomed open and then Quill ran into the room, panting as he held out a handful of messages. As he skidded to a halt in front of him he panted, "From Winterfell, my lord, most urgent." A glance at Quill's face was enough to send dread roiling through him. Something terrible had happened in Winterfell. Damn it. What though? He took the messages and glanced at them quickly. They were marked with Stannis's red ribbon. Multiple important messages sent via multiple ravens. Not good. As he read the first one, conscious of every eye being on him, he found his eyebrows heading upwards in shock. After a long moment he finally drew a breath. "My lords, Prince Oberyn, High Septon, word from Winterfell. The Kingslayer has finally admitted as to why he killed Aerys Targaryen." The words were spoken hoarsely. "To please his father, surely," the Dornish prince stated through narrowed eyes. Why else? According to this, no. He cleared his throat, which was suddenly tight. According to a confession heard by Lord Robb Stark, Lord Tyrion Lannister and Sir Barristan Selmy, confirmed later by His Grace King Robert, he killed Aerys because the Mad King had ordered that caches of wildfire be hidden around King's Landing in order to destroy the rebel army when it arrived. Caches under every gate. Under the Dragon Pit. Under the Great September. In many other places. And, under the Red Keep. Silence fell as they all stared at him. Before that silence was broken by the sound of a silver goblet hitting the ground as Oberyn Martell went from lounging to bolt upright on his feet in the blink of an eye. What? He darted over and then took one of the messages from the shaking hands of Quill, before glaring at it. Wildfire. Here. Under here. So it says, Jon replied, still in a hoarse voice, as he felt his legs tremble. The others were all white-faced with shock, whilst Pycelle's mouth was open as he gaped at him. He couldn't blame any of them. Then he pulled himself together. Quill, summon Sir Davos Seaworth. And assemble as many men as you can. We must search the cellars and tunnels below the Red Keep to find out if this tale is true. The High Septon caught his eye and he added, the Great September too. High Septon, we will need members of your order who are familiar with the tunnels under your building. Wait, Martell said. Your men should use lanterns. No brand's wildfire is filthy stuff that matures over time. One spark in the wrong place could ignite a batch. And if it has been down there since the rebellion, he went even whiter. Then any containers might be leaking. Your men must be very careful. If they see green liquid they must stop, note the place and then leave at once without touching a thing. Jon peered at him. The Dornish prince's voice had a sharp note of command. Prince Oberyn, you seem familiar with this substance. Oberyn Martell shrugged. I studied it in the Citadel. It was dangerous but interesting. Interesting. He didn't think that he could ever use that word for that disgusting stuff. He had never forgiven Aerys Targaryen for murdering Rickard Stark in such a disgusting manner. Then he made his decision. Prince Oberyn, given your familiarity with wildfire, I would like to ask if you could lead the search parties under the Red Keep. The Dornish prince, who was also dangerous but interesting, in an observe from a distance at times sort of way, paused to think, before nodding tersely. Jon looked at Quill and flickered his eyes at Martell. His servant tilted his head in recognition before following the Dornishman as he swept out of the room barking commands for Seaworth to meet him at once. Jon returned his attention to the table. Pycelle was standing and for once his back was unbent and his shoulders were straight. I will lead the search in the Great September, he said very firmly. I too studied wildfire at the Citadel. I know what to look for as well. As the Grand Maester strode out, not shuffled, not now, Jon sighed and sat down. And now all they could do was wait. Wait and think about just how mad the Mad King had been. Tyrion. He stared at the wall in the library and suppressed the need to throw things at it. Damn Joffrey to every one of the seven hells. He hoped that whatever demons existed there would gnaw on his face and bugger his ass, the little shit. His family. His bloody family. Every time he took a step forwards they dragged him 2 steps back. First Jaime and Cersei were found committing incest, throwing the family name into the nearest privy, and then Joffrey compounded everything by trying to stick a stolen Valyrian steel knife at that. Into Robb Stark's back. He closed his eyes and ran his hand over his forehead tiredly. Would Ned Stark honor the talk they had had about Daisy? Would he want anything to do with him now? He almost wanted to bloody well cry. No. This was not the end. He was not Jaime or Joffrey, he was Tyrion Lannister, bearer of Rocktooth and a good friend to House Stark. He hoped. Someone cleared his throat in front of him and he opened his eyes and looked at Jory Castle, who nodded formally at him. Beg pardon, Lord Tyrion, but Lord Robb would like a word with you in the Godswood. He says that he has something important to talk to you about. His eyebrows rose and fell for a moment as he considered that. Oh. What was this about? He thought about everything for a moment and then he stood and nodded back. Of course. I will go there at once. As he waddled down the corridor he sighed a little. Life had been somewhat complicated of late. a little too packed with events that raised the pulse from a trot to a gallop. It was all a bit busy and Pod hopefully wasn't learning too many interesting new words. The godswood loomed ahead of him before he knew it, and he paused and adjusted his jerkin a little. There weren't too many lions on it, which was important. No, House Lannister really was not in very good standing right now in the court, although Uncle Jerian was still cheerfully wearing what he had always worn, whilst pointing out every now and then that he was of House Lannister of the Summer Isles and that there was a difference. Robb Stark was sitting in front of the pool by the heart tree. He was dressed in a cloak that concealed his left hand, and from the way that he was holding himself he was in a bit of pain. As Tyrion approached he looked over and then smiled slightly. "I'm afraid that all I can offer you for a seat is a tree root," he said quietly. "Better than nothing though." After a moment of careful inspection he found a spot that wasn't too intrusive and sat down. "You sent for me?" "I did." Robb paused and looked into the pool. "I am indeed the boy who died and fell through time. The old gods brought me back from the moment of my death." The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end from the matter-of-fact way that the younger man said those words. Then he added, "I would have died about, almost 2 years from now." "Will have." A frown. "The tenses get me a bit muddled up." That was understandable. But disturbing. "And what happened in that time?" Those unsettlingly old eyes focused on him. "Why, I fought a war, Tyrion. And then I was betrayed and I died." He stared at the heir of Ned Stark. "You fought a war? Against who?" "Surely it was against the others." "Wait. You fought a war? I'm not altogether sure I like the way that you worded that." Robb sighed and ran his right hand through his reddish hair. "This is complicated. I come from a time when Jon Arryn died and King Robert came north to ask my father to go to King's Landing with him and be his hand. Much that has happened in this time did not happen in that other time. Father went south because there was no warning about the return of the others. The call was never sent out. Father never had a vision from the old gods because of me. The great Jon never checked the hearthstone, Father's solar was never searched and the room was not found, so the call was never sent. The others still came, but we knew nothing of them. Something like horror rooted him to the spot. But if the call was never sent, then who were you fighting against?" A ghost of a pained smile flashed across Robb's face. "Your father mostly. I should tell you that I came from a time when Joffrey was king. And the truth of his birth was first not well known and then heartily denied by your father. No, this time it was outright horror. The idea of that little shit being king was just horrifying. Joffrey was king. What happened to King Robert? He never found Stormbreaker. He was," Robb seemed to search for the right words. "Old. Drunk. Fat. Defeated. Apparently he went hunting and was gored by a boar. Sounds odd, I know, but rumor had it that he was drunker than he thought. Father was hanged, but he was betrayed and Joffrey ordered him beheaded at the Great September. So I called my banners and marched south. It was complicated. Your father was already attacking the Riverlands to get you back. To get me back." Robb sighed again and then he recounted a tale of utter madness that made Tyrion's eyebrows fly up and stay up. No call. Bran's mysterious fall. Him at the wall because he wanted to see it, not because he had been summoned there by the old gods. Cersei being a bitch on numerous occasions. An attack on Bran. Robb pulled his left hand free of his cloak when he got to that part, which was holding the Valyrian steel dagger that Joffrey had attacked him with. As he handed it over, he said, "The cut purse had that on him. Now I know that it was Joffrey's. But at the time we did not know that. Mother took it south to King's Landing and Petter Baelish told her that it had been his before he lost it to you." Baelish. Bloody buggering Baelish. What had that maggot been up to, truly? He took the dagger with a frown. "A deadly thing. And, you therefore thought that I had given it to this man as payment to kill Bran?" "Why?" Robb shrugged. "Lysa Arryn told Mother that your family murdered Jon Arryn. Mother later found out that her sister was as mad as a spring hare." He winced. "We did not trust Lannisters. And with the odd circumstances of Bran's fall he had always been so sure-footed before we leapt to some hasty conclusions. Mother especially. She ordered you arrested on the road to King's Landing and taken to the Eyrie. And your father called the banners for you. My, he said, more than a bit astonished. I never knew that father cared so much for me. Ah. Wait. It was the Lannister name he was truly fighting for, of course. Still, I am just a trifle touched. He leant back and then winced as a nodule of wood pressed against his back. So, there was a war. The War of the Five Kings, the small folk called it. He stared at Robb. 5. That sounds a bit much. Joffrey was one, obviously, but, Stannis was another. Then who were the three other kings? I was proclaimed the king in the north and the Riverlands. Robb said it with a look that was partly sad and partly proud. Balon Greyjoy proclaimed himself king of the Iron Islands. And Renly Baratheon proclaimed himself king as well. Tyrion tilted his head and removed some wax from one ear, to make sure that he had heard properly. Renly Baratheon. Did Stannis die? No. But he's the youngest of the Baratheon brothers. He had no claim to the Iron Throne after Robert's death. He had the Tyrells on his side. And he thought, I suppose, that might made right. Might made right. He made a note of that term. Not bad. But still. Laura's Tyrell. Oh dear. So there was a five-sided war. I presume that my father was in charge of his faction, rather than Joffrey. But he made the mistake of placing Jaime in charge of the forces besieging Riverrun. A wolfish smile crossed Robb's face. I beat your brother and captured him. I relieved Riverrun. And I attacked into the Westerlands. There was a battle at Oxcross. A complex mixture of emotions crossed his face. I regret much of that, given what I know now. Given that I know what's coming. So much death. What was coming then as well? The others were coming and I didn't suspect a damn thing. And then, well, the Ironborn attacked the north. They could have had their pick of the Westerlands and the Reach, but no, Balon Greyjoy wanted his revenge against my dead father. There was a pause as Tyrion watched the other man. He could not think of a word to say that would help against that further complex combination of emotions on his face. And then. He said the words as gently as he could. Father was not around to tell me who to trust and who to distrust. I had made mistakes. I'm good at war, Tyrion. I'm very good at war. But politics is more complex. And I trusted the wrong people. Your father found that out. And I was betrayed. And I died. And then I woke up here. He looked at Robb for a long moment and saw the pain that was stored in those eyes. I sense that there's a lot that you've skipped over. I have. Everything's different now. We know what's coming. The incest has been revealed. Joffrey will never be king. The call has gone out. Stannis is different as well. He was never going to be Hand of the King in that other world. And he was different. Different how? Mother met him and Renly and tried to get them to reconcile. But Stannis was being advised by a Shadowbinder priestess from Ass High. Before the two could meet in battle near Storm's End, Mother saw a shadow slay Renly Baratheon. A shadow with the face of Stannis Baratheon. If he sat here rooted in horror for much longer, then there would be a chance that he'd turn into a tree. Instead he stood and then peered at the heart tree. Your tale is all of woe, he said eventually. I am guessing that various armies slaughtered the small folk as if they were worth nothing. Robb sighed. And before you ask, crops ravaged, homes burned, barns destroyed, flocks slaughtered or scattered. Folly. He straightened a little. Then it is no wonder that the old gods sent you back. I cannot imagine the bloodbath that must have followed on the wall after the others assaulted it. He paused and then remembered that dream from the road to Winterfell. Or perhaps I can. I had a terrible dream on the way here. The Iron Islands lost, Winterfell besieged by the others, the Westerlands lost, the king vanished in the Riverlands, Dawn having closed its borders. Yes, we must avoid that. He looked back at Robb. I want to marry your cousin Daisy. That will make us kin. Could you stand to be related to a Lannister? Robb smiled at him. We fought together at the wall. You killed another. And Daisy likes you. You are not your father or your brother. So yes. I can stand to be related to you. You're a good man, Tyrion. And you know what's coming. You know what's at stake. There was another pause and then they shook hands. Chapter 38. Chapter text. Robb Returns started off at the Alternate History Forum, where a group of very talented people have commented / contributed ideas / submitted astonishingly good pictures. Please see here for some amazing art by Yusif 56. The chapter below was written by Sada, with my permission. Daeron. The young lord of the Red Dunes sat on the side of his bed, having just woken up from a restless night's sleep. He couldn't remember the last time he had gotten a good night's rest, and yet he also couldn't remember what he was having dreams about. But, somehow, he knew it was the same dream every night because he kept waking up cold and shivering. How strange, he thought to himself. Getting up from his bed, he picked up his Valyrian steel sword, Truth, that was leaning against the wall on his left. It felt good in his hand as he swung it around, trying carefully not to cut himself, even though he had been practicing tirelessly with it for the past several months. The blade itself was a brilliant black with a wavy pattern that strangely almost seemed to move, as if the ocean itself was contained inside the blade. The grip was made of a rare unpolished dark hardwood from the Summer Isles, and the crossguard made of the same hardwood inlaid with spiraling tendrils of ivory that fed into the rain guard. The circular rain guard and the pommel were made of the same ornately carved ivory, and inlaid into the rain guard was the symbol of House Faith, 3 leopards, carved from rare black pearls. That part was compliment of his father, who had had the ivory carved from symbol of House Rugaria, his mother's family. The sword was truly a work of art. And it had ended up here, in the Vaith, with him. Daeron's mind then thought back to when he had first received the blade from his grandmother. It was on Daeron's 16th name-a-day, when he legally came of age. When she gave him Truth, she told him that it was the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of House Rugaria, once a prosperous banking family from Lies which was now destitute. The blade had been used for centuries in Essos in many wars and conflicts, but Migor Rugaria, Daeron's maternal grandfather, had wanted to sell the blade to revive the family fortune. Daeron's mother, however, did not want the blade to leave the family and end up in some fat magister's house collecting dust, so she decided to secretly take it from her family estate in Lies, unbeknownst to her father. And when she married his father, Lord Aaron Vaith, she hid it in the Vaith, out of reach of her father. They both had intended for him to use it when he came of age and pass it on to his heirs, but they would never see that day. Daeron's parents had died when he was just a baby, and he subsequently was raised by his grandmother. Holding the sword for the first time after hearing how it had come into his possession had flooded him with emotion. He had been joyous and sad, melancholy and proud all at the same time. But then grandmother had gone on, lecturing to him about how he had a responsibility as the last true-born member of House Faith to continue the family line and marry as soon as possible. That was the worst part of the day, and she continued to drone on about his other lordly responsibilities after that. It was all extremely boring from that point on, not like how he expected his 16th name-a-day to be. He then walked over to his desk and sat in his chair, seeing the stack of ravens on his desk that had piled up over the past several months. In these letters were disputes he had to oversee, the tax reports of the small folk, agricultural production of his realm, and a mess of other things. Daeron sighed and rubbed his forehead. Before grandmother had died just a few weeks after his name-a-day, she had gradually been acclimating him to the work of a lord, but now he had to take it all on himself, though Maester Horan helped out quite a bit. And yet, even with all of this work to do, he had even more to think about. The fact that magic had apparently returned to the world had been the first of the things that had greatly puzzled him. Maester Horan dismissed it as some sort of mistake, a wrong message that came from some confused maester in Old Town. That was a few months ago. Things had gotten only stranger after that. Then the call had gone out and everything went sideways. Some small folk from the Vaith began to leave and head north, and others began to stock up on food and supplies. Several stony Dornish lords had even started to send supplies and men to the war. Even the stars had shifted, he had noticed when stargazing at night. And Uncle Alster had left from Starfall practically possessed and, not to mention, very ill, yet he had made it to King's Landing where he died and made his cousin Ned the new Sword of the Morning. If that wasn't unsettling enough, word had spread that Stormbreaker, the Fist of Winter, and other Bane had all been uncovered by houses Baratheon, Stark, and Tyrell respectively. All great, ancient weapons made in the time of the first men, he had learned. Even the king himself had gone to Winterfell. But Maester Horan had been very dismissive of all these events, saying that it either must have been false news or some kind of new plot by the Starks and Baratheons. Sadly, he was like the rest of the sandy and salty Dornish lords, stubborn and skeptical. But he knew that all of it was true. He had not heard the call, but he felt it. What was he to do? Daeron was then suddenly shaken out of his thought when someone knocked on his bedroom door. "Come in," he said. Maester Horan opened the door and the short, bald and friendly-looking Dornishman walked into his bedroom holding a letter. Daeron stood up and greeted the man who had helped raise him with a smile. "Good morning, Horan. How are you?" "Well, my lord, thank you for asking," Horan replied. "I have a message for you." "Is it from Lord Gargallan again?" Daeron groaned. "Does he still want me to marry that ugly granddaughter of his?" "No, Daeron, but you should watch how you speak of your fellow lords and ladies. Besides, you should be thinking of marriage matches anyway, you are." Daeron quickly interrupted, "I know the last of my family line and all that. Can you just tell me where the message is from?" Horan sighed and said, "It is from Winterfell." "Winterfell? Why would I receive a message from there?" "It is most peculiar, my lord. A messenger who claimed that he had come straight from White Harbor delivered it just a few minutes ago. He said it was most urgent. And it bears the seal of House Dane on it." As Daeron received the letter from Maester Horan, he looked at the red wax seal. A falling star crossed by a sword. "It must be from my cousin, Lord Edric," Daeron said curiously. Why had Ned written him? He should be in Winterfell right now, and it would take weeks to get a raven from all the way up north down to Dorne, and even longer on horseback. As he unfurled it, he noticed it was rather long. How strange. "He is the new Sword of the Morning, correct?" Horan asked. Daeron nodded and began to read. "Cousin. It is good to write you again, though I wish it was under better circumstances. I know I have not seen you in a couple of years, but I still consider you to be a close family member and a good friend. And now you are some of the only family I have left. Some of the only family I have that I can rely on, that is." They had that in common, he thought. Ned was the only family he had left other than that Whoreson, the Dark Star. "First I must let you know of what has transpired here recently in Winterfell. Cersei Lannister, the Queen, was found coupling with her brother, Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard. It was witnessed by Lord Eddard Stark, Lord Stannis Baratheon, and Sir Barristan Selmy. Sir Jaime has also confessed to fathering the royal children, and they have been taken out of the succession. Both have been arrested. Sir Jaime then fought the king in a trial by combat and lost, and is going to the wall to take the black. He had to reread that part several times before it truly sunk in. He had no personal grudge against the Lannisters, but as a Dornishman, he was usually expected to be happy at news like this. He was not. He knew what this meant for the realm. Maester Horan, seeing the shock on his face, made a face that would seem he thought that Daeron had turned purple. "What is it?" Horan said worryingly at him. Peeling his eyes off of the letter, Daeron quietly replied, "The Queen was found having relations with her brother, Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard, in Winterfell. Witnessed by Lord Eddard Stark, Lord Stannis Baratheon and Sir Barristan Selmy," Daeron said flatly, staring into the space in front of him. "And the royal children have all been taken out of the line of succession, as they were found to be born of this incest, by the confession of Sir Jaime Lannister." Daeron could almost hear Maester Horan's jaw drop to the floor. "What?" Horan shouted. With her brother, then, the true heir is Lord Stannis," he continued, stammering. "Pew. But he has only a sickly girl as his heir. This is disastrous. The realm has no true heirs." He trailed off, seemingly going into his own form of shock. But Daeron kept reading the letter, ignoring Horan's reaction. "But there is a greater matter I write to you about. The others have returned. There is proof. On the road to Winterfell, I saw a man of the night's watch carrying the caged head of a wight, which is a corpse raised from the dead by the others. He carries it south from beyond the wall to show proof of what we face. By this time, Daron was in too much shock not to keep reading, so, after a pause and rereading that section several times over, he went on with the letter. I can only imagine what you must be thinking right now. If I had not seen the wight myself, I would not have believed it. But I know you have heard the call. The blood of the first men is strong. I must ask that you join me here in Winterfell. The entire the realm needs all the help it can get if we are going to defeat the others and drive back the night. I hope to see you soon, cousin. Ned. As Daron finished the letter, he set it down on his desk next to the other ravens. He then took a very audible gulp, and could feel himself beginning to sweat. It almost seemed surreal, like he was in some sort of nightmare. Then Maester Horan picked up and read the letter, and reread it again, at which point he began to rub his very sweaty bald head vigorously and rapidly tap his foot on the ground. Daron then slowly strode over to the balcony in his room overlooking the river Vaith, and gazed out towards his realm. He saw the orchards, and the fruit trees heavy with blood oranges, lemons, and grapefruits, ripe for picking, that extended along the coastline of the river Vaith and into the harsh desert for several leagues. And the river, which cut through the rocky hills and red sands of the Dornish desert like a knife made of sapphire, which gave life to the desert. He saw the slim merchant barges that went up and down the river Vaith, docking at the small jetties on the banks of the river, bringing goods to trade in the small village that surrounded the tall and pale castle of his ancestors. It all seemed so peaceful. He almost wanted to stay here in the warmth of the Dornish sun, where his home was. Where it was safe. But that thought was quickly wrenched from his mind as he imagined all of this all destroyed, frozen in eternal winter, and his people killed and raised from the dead as wights by the others. Daron then turned around, to face his bedroom and Maester Horan who was sitting at his desk in deep thought. He then stared at Truth, which still leaned against the wall next to his bed. He would definitely be using the blade, though he wished it was under better circumstances. Horan, Daron said in a hoarse voice. Yes, my lord. Horan replied as he quickly turned his head towards him. Have the servants prepare my things. And find the fastest ship coin can buy. I must leave for Winterfell at once. Chapter 39. Chapter text. Robert. The trees shook with the howl of whatever the fuck that thing was, trembled almost in fear. Lyanna's face contorted in terror as she stared at the tree line and then she was trying to shout something over the wind that had sprung up as he ran after her. She was hanging in midair, pulled by something. He screamed her name, stretching out his hand, so close to hers, just a little further and he'd be able to touch her, but she kept moving away from him, faster and faster, and then he woke up suddenly, coming bolt upright, his chest heaving as if he had been running. After a long moment he ran a shaking hand over his face. That damn dream again. He'd been so close to catching her. He shook his head and then got out of bed and padded to the window. Dawn was breaking over Winterfell and he stared out as the guards were relieved on the walls. The walls of Winterfell were thick and old and he had a feeling that the fortress had been built on the hot springs for a reason. If the wall ever fell then Winterfell would be the logical place to retreat to. HMMPH Winterfell. Why call it that? How could winter fall? A king of winter perhaps. Perhaps a king of the others had died here. He needed to talk to Ned. He walked back to the bed and stared at it. It was odd waking up alone these days. Oh, there were more than enough willing women here at Winterfell, judging by the sultry looks and the magically loosened bodices, but now that he wasn't in his cups every night he felt different. It didn't feel right to roll in the sheets with some girl when he was over Lyanna's grave, or close enough to it. She wouldn't have approved. He felt closer to her now than he had for many years. Those damn dreams though. Dressing did not take long and then he picked up Stormbreaker and opened the door. Selmy was there waiting for him. Your Grace the King's Guard said with a respectful nod. There are no urgent messages for you from the Lord Hand, or from King's Landing. Good, he replied as they strode down the corridor. Anything from the wall? No, Your Grace. He nodded and then continued on towards the great hall and breakfast. The Starks were arriving as they entered the hall, along with others, and he suppressed a smile as Bran Stark waved enthusiastically to young Edric and Robb Returns, who waved back and then mouthed what must have been plans that presumably must have made sense to Bran, who nodded back at them and then started eating his food at a speed that was not healthy. Messy too. He greeted Ned and Cat, nodded at Robb and Jon and then sat down, started his own breakfast, sparing the odd glance for the terrible threesome, all of whom seemed to be eating at the same furious pace. After a while he looked at Ned, raised his eyebrows and then jerked his head at Bran. Ned looked, rolled his eyes and then had a whispered word with Cat, who then muttered a stern warning to her son about the perils of eating too quickly. As she did that he caught the eye of young Rickon, who was sneaking a piece of toasted bread off of his mother's plate. He winked at him. The little boy giggled and then winked in an exaggerated manner back at him. He watched Ned and his family for a while, with a certain wistful sadness running through him. It was obvious that his old friend was very close to his family and his wife, in a way that Cersei had never been. No. Thinking about Cersei was a bad idea, it just left him angry at the damage that selfish bitch had inflicted to the realm. He needed an heir. He had one, Stannis, who was glaring at his porridge as if it had wronged him somehow, but that wasn't good enough. He needed an heir born from his own loins, otherwise certain lords would think that he was weak, or, even worse, infertile. Of course the irony was that he knew full well that he was as fertile as a herd of bulls, it was just that his children were thanks to that bitch all bastards. He looked at Edric, who was being told off by Penrose for eating too fast. He was a good lad, but too young. To one side Gendry was sitting there, looking uncomfortable, talking quietly to Maya. They looked so much like him. He needed to talk to Stannis about this. After breakfast he strode out into the main courtyard, where his log was waiting, and as he hoisted it onto his shoulders he made a note to add another 2 circuits of the courtyard that morning, to walk off the bile that he could feel in the pit of his stomach. Right. This was important. He would return to his old fitness, the best form of his life, and let that cold bitch choke on the knowledge that he had been inspired to do so by her behavior. By the time he had done his 25 turns around the courtyard he was sweating like a pig and aching in his shoulders and legs, but as he lowered the log to the ground and stretched until his spine popped he felt as alive as he ever had. He poured a bucket of water over his head to get rid of the worst of his sweat and then strode off to his quarters to change, avoiding the terrible threesome as they hurtled down a corridor, chased by a red-faced Septa Mordain. As he walked into Ned's solar, which he was sharing with the Lord of the North, he could see that Stannis was already there with a pile of Raven messages. "Your Grace," said his brother formally, "today's messages." He nodded and then they plunged into it, and as Stannis talked he found himself realizing yet again that Stannis was bloody good at this. For one thing he had sorted the messages out into 3 piles, urgent like the latest message from Castle Black about condition of the wall, as well as the latest sighting of the others by rangers and wildlings, moderately important like the fact that the fighting on the Iron Islands seemed to have died down a bit, and finally dross like the messages from various lordlings saying that their daughters were available for marriage. "You'll be getting a lot of these," Stannis said as he held one up. "Lord Tendring of the Riverlands says that his daughter Alice is of an age to get married." He paused to recall the woman. "Alice Tendring is 36 years old, has a flat chest, a nose like a crow and is so clever that she has a tongue like a Valyrian steel dagger. She also from a house that is ludicrously small. It's said that she's still a maid. And likely to stay one. No." And then they plunged into the important messages again. Again, Stannis navigated his way through them, focusing on the important ones and mentioning the dross only in passing. Yes, Stannis was a good hand of the king. Lunch intervened, a relatively simple affair involving crusty bread, a rich stew and well-watered wine. Not what he might have eaten months ago, but it was enough. When they were finished he wandered back out again and eventually found himself on the walls of Winterfell, looking down at the denizens of the place as they went about their business. He watched as Domeric Bolton tutored the terrible threesome, observed from a distance by Lords Royce and Redfort. And he also watched as Gendry worked in the smithy, striding out on a regular basis to stack a new white spearhead on a growing pile. He noted that his older son was also being watched by a curious Arya Stark. After a while Maya came to the smithy to get Gendry for a riding lesson, something that seemed to annoy the lad a bit at first. Robert watched them for a while and then turned and stared north. They were coming. He knew it. He could feel it. There was a threat to the realm, the greatest threat that it had seen for thousands of years, and he knew it in a way that he had never felt before. Death itself was coming and he had to concentrate on that, but there were so many damn distractions. Damn Circe. Damn her to the lowest of the 7 hells. Her father was coming and he had to meet the bloody man and tell him just what was what. Robert. He whirled around to see Ned standing there, a disapproving look on his face. You are brooding. He eyed his old friend. I can brood if I like. I'm the bloody king. Ned replied. And we need you to stop brooding and be the bloody king. You must lead us, Robert. You have to stop this brooding and move on to leading us. He took a step forwards. I did not tell you the full truth before. Yes, you have not been the best of kings and I know why. Lionel's death hit you hard and you've wallowed in depression since. But that needs to be put in the past. You've worked very hard to get fit again, but we need you to stop brooding and bloody well lead us. You know what's coming. You know what's coming for us all. That statue told you to be the Storm King when you discovered Stormbreaker. That's what we need. The Storm King, Robert Baratheon. My friend. There was a long pause and then he wiped a tear from his eye. Damn it, Ned, it's easier said than done. Storm King. How do I become a Storm King? What do I do? Ned shrugged and then threw him a practice sword. I don't bloody know. You hold Stormbreaker. You'll find out. Now follow me. I'm going to thrash some sense into you on the practice yards. He followed Ned down off the walls with a sigh, before passing into the practice yards. Selmy was standing there to one side, nodding as he passed, and then Ned raised his own practice sword and they both launched into it. It was like being in the Eyrie again, under the gaze of Jon, only this time they were older. He was reminded of the fight against the Kingslayer. Although, of course, Ned didn't have a sword that kept shattering into 100 pieces. Ned won the first bout, he won the second one, and then they had a long drawn-out third one that Ned barely won. As they both leant on their swords, panting, he chuckled. I've missed this, Ned. Gods, it's good to see you again. You need more practice, Ned wheezed. Sir Barristan's teaching you well, but you need more. You're not using a warhammer anymore these days. He grinned at Ned. A sword, as old as your fist. He straightened and rubbed his back. There really is something going on here, Ned, isn't there? You finding the fist, me finding Stormbreaker. He paused. Does it make you feel any different? Ned looked at him rather oddly. Different in what way? He was about to say dutiful, when he realized that Ned had that word written all the way through him. Instead he shook his head. Never mind. Another bout. They fought another, that he just about won, judging by Sir Barristan's comments, and then a last hard-fought bout that Ned won by the skin of his teeth. Once he caught his breath and slapped Ned on the back. He paused. You're a good man, Ned. Better than me. I always knew that. But Ned shook his head. You always tread the same path as me, Robert. You just need to be nudged back onto it once in a while. Ned's smile vanished after a moment. I'll meet you in the Godswood later for the ceremony. He smiled tightly at that, before striding off back to his quarters, where he plunged into the bath that was waiting for him there and scrubbed the stink off him. After he dressed, he opened the door and nodded at the waiting Stannis, who strode in with the afternoon list of messages. They were sorted into the same 3 piles and once again they dealt with the wheat before the chaff. That said, even the dross had to be dealt with, as an ignored idiot might one day become a truculent or even rebellious idiot. Once the last message was dealt with and Sir Barristan had entered the room and muttered that it was time, they both stood. Robert put his crown on, clasped his cloak on, grabbed Stormbreaker and then strode out, followed by the other 2 men. Down the corridor they passed, acknowledged by the inhabitants as they passed, and then out into the courtyard, heading towards the Godswood. As they entered the little wood, a hush seemed to settle over the little group, a stillness that came from the trees. He looked around as they strode over the dense moss and luxuriant grass, and he noted that the trees seemed to be a bit redder of leaf and whiter of trunk. But above all he got this overwhelming sense of time, almost pressing down on his shoulders, time of an ancient sort. It made him shudder a little. Ned was waiting for them at the heart tree. He had the Fist of Winter in his belt and was dressed formally, as the Lord of the North. He had a hand on the tree and looked up at them as they approached. Robert nodded at Stannis and Sabaristan and they both turned to look back at the way they had came for the party that was soon to arrive. Robert stepped forwards to join Ned. "How old is this place?" Ned's eyebrows went up. "The gods would. Easily as old as the castle." "Why?" He shivered a little. "I can feel something here, Ned. Like the weight of something. Time maybe." Ned looked around. "You feel the eyes of the old gods, your grace. They are always here." And that was enough to make him shiver. The old gods, he'd never really thought about them before, not really, but the weight of age in this place. "Your grace, they are coming," Sabaristan called, and he looked up to see Lord Commander Mormont and the castles escorting the Kingslayer through the trees, followed by Tyrion, Geryon and Illyrian Lannister and then Robb and Jon Stark. The last three lions were pale-faced but composed. The Kingslayer on the other looked terrible. There were black circles under his eyes and he looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. Oh, and the moment he caught sight of his king he flinched more than a bit and then glared around at the trees as if they were about to assault him. Mormont brought that treacherous sack of shit up before them and then stood to one side. "Sir Jaime Lannister," he said eventually. "You have been sentenced to join the Night's Watch. And you will now say your vows, as you have requested." "Lord Stark." Ned stepped forwards, his eyes in shadow, as he pulled out the fist and held it in front of him with his hands on both ends. "Sir Jaime Lannister, this is the Fist of Winter, the weapon of the Starks of old and the North's age-old symbol of justice and punishment. You will swear your oaths with one hand on the heart tree and one hand on the fist. And know this: such an oath cannot be broken. If you do break you will die." He shuddered a little at the utter finality in Ned's voice, but not nearly as much as the Kingslayer, who swayed a little. "I thought," the blonde shit said in a low voice, "that I was going to swear this vow at the September." "The old gods are not in the September," Ned growled. "They are here. Your vow here, in this place, will bind you in ways that a vow at the September will not in the same way. Let me make this very clear, Kingslayer. Break this vow and you will die." The Kingslayer's mouth worked slightly as he seemed to weigh up what to say next. He glanced back at the party of now grim-faced Lannisters and Robert noticed that Tyrion seemed to nod slightly. And then, shoulders slumped, he turned back and nodded at Ned. "I will swear this oath here and now, Stark." Mormont gestured at the heart tree and the fist, and the blonde shit sighed and reached out to place a hand on each. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins," he said. "It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come." And then, as he said the last words, red light flared from three places from where his hand touched the tree, where it touched the fist and, most shockingly, from Ned's eyes, which blazed suddenly with red flames. He stifled an oath, not being the only one given the shocked mutterings from behind him. Stormbreaker felt warm in his hands all of a sudden and he looked down to see that it was shining in a way that he had never seen before. Then he looked around. Stannis and Sabaristan were standing there, thunderstruck, whilst the castles and younger Starks were all falling to their knees hurriedly. Tyrion Lannister was staring at Rocktooth, which was also shining, whilst the other three Lannisters looked baffled. And then Ned, or whatever was looking through his eyes, looked the Kingslayer. "A Casterly lion. Well, are you of Lan the clever snake, or are you as faithless as his father? The old gods are here to witness your oath. Should you break this oath, then you will die in an instant, as quick as lightning falls from the sky. The fist has power over your oath, child of Casterly Rock. Hold to it though and your life will change. The others come. The Stark has called for aid. You are needed." Jaime Lannister was shaking like a leaf as he stared, wide-eyed, at Ned. He said in a trembling voice at last, "I will hold to my oath." The red-flamed eyes stared at him. "See that you do." Then they turned to Robert. Storm King. He cleared his throat to make sure that no squeak would emerge. I trust yourself. And your blood. Much depends on you. And then the red flames vanished, to reveal a rather puzzled Ned. What just happened? The old gods just spoke through you, Father Robb Stark called out an instant before his brother. Ah, said Ned, before looking back at the ashen-faced Jaime Lannister, who was now trembling in every limb. Very well. Lord Commander. Mormont shook himself out of his own state of shock. Ah, Sir Jaime, my new brother. We must talk. And you must prepare for your trip to the wall. It wasn't until they got back to the Great Hall, where wine was waiting for them all, that his hands finally stopped shaking with shock. Does this kind of thing often happen to you, Ned? He asked in as jovial tone as he could express as the crowd around them buzzed with the news. 3 bloody times now, Ned groused. Once here, which led to Frostfyre coming to Winterfell. Once at the wall, where the old gods cured Maester Aemon's blindness through me, and now, this. Well, he drawled after taking a long gulp of wine and then looking at the place where a white-faced Kingslayer was sitting, still shaking. It obviously has its uses. As the afternoon merged into the evening, that moment in the Godswood stayed in his mind, and not just his. He found Stannis staring in the direction of the Godswood a few times, his face working with thought, whilst Sir Barristan seemed to be valiantly fighting off a pervasive sense of shock that was similar to Mormont's. Dinner was subdued. Ned was in a brown study half the time, whilst Cat talked worriedly with Robb and Jon, whilst the other children listened with their ears all but wagging in her direction. The Lannisters were in one corner, talking in low and intent voices, their overall aspect one of, again, shock. As for him, he sipped at his wine again and toyed at his legs of chicken until hunger and thirst made him consume them both. And then he stared at the fire in the great range. He felt as if he was standing on ground that might move under his feet very swiftly, but he could not tell in which direction. And he was tired. So he gave up. He clapped both Ned and Stannis on the shoulder, made his excuses and left for his chambers, where he brooded for a while in a chair, his fingers drumming on the hilt of Stormbreaker. It hadn't been his imagination, it had glowed earlier. The sword of his ancestors. As he eventually got into bed and pulled the sheets over his body, he stared at the ceiling for a long time before he finally blew the candle out and turned over to get some sleep. And, of course, the dream started. The trees shook with the howl of whatever the fuck that thing was, trembled almost in fear. Lyanna's face contorted in terror as she stared at the tree line, and then she was trying to shout something over the wind that had sprung up as he ran after her. She was hanging in midair, pulled by something. He screamed her name, stretching out his hand, so close to hers, just a little further and he'd be able to touch her, but she kept moving away from him, faster and faster, and then he reached out just that bit further and caught her. And everything stopped. Oberyn. It was late, even as he reckoned time. The moon had set but parts of the city were still bustling. Oberyn had unrolled a great map of the city out onto the table, securing the ends with candlesticks, and as men came and went with their messages, some pale-faced and trembling as they handed them over, the old Lord of the Vale added yet another circle of red ink with a number next to it. The numbers were beyond troubling. As he stared at the map from his perch on the desk to one side, he suppressed a shiver. The memory of the search would stay in his memories for some time to come, and in his nightmares. Especially the moment that he had unbarred that old storeroom door in the very bottom of the Red Keep, filled with barrel after unmarked barrel, and then saw the eerie green glow from the seeping green slime at the base of the barrels. He had told the rest of the men to stay out and had then crept in, on feet as stealthy as he could make them be, to count the barrels. The room had been larger than he had thought. And the number of barrels had been greater than his worst fears. And now there was a red circle around the Red Keep on the map, with the notation 350 barrels next to it. The thought of it made his skin crawl. The growing number of other red marks made the sensation even worse. As for the other men in the room, well, Oberyn was sitting there and staring bleakly at the map, his nose beakier than even with tension. Valerian was half slumped in his chair, his face grey, whilst Merryweather was a red-eyed wraith at a window, looking out over the lights of the city. And then there were the two others. The huddled figure of the head pyromancer at the head of the table, and the grim-faced presence of Sir Davos Seaworth next to him, clutching a short sword and eyeing the pyromancer balefully. The door opened again and Pycelle strode in with the High Septon next to him. Both looked weary and somber. "We have a count of the cash under the Great September," Pycelle said tiredly as they both sat at the table. "At least 250 barrels. Erin blanched but then reached out and dipped the quill in the inkstand and added yet another circle and annotation next to it. "So, then," he said in an admirably level voice. "That takes the total to a truly disturbing number. There are 50 barrels beneath each of the gates. The Dragon Pit contains 300 barrels. The Great September has 250. The Red Keep has 350. And there are additional caches of at least 50 barrels under the streets of Steel and Sisters." As the others groaned or looked as if a ghost had walked over their graves, Oberyn stood up, grabbed a piece of foolscap from the desk and then crossed over to the table, where he pulled out the special little pen that he had designed for himself that used slivers of hard charcoal. He frowned for a moment as he recalled the formulas from his youth and then he started to calculate quietly. "But why?" Valerian all but wailed. "Why would Aerys order this?" "He was called the Mad King for a reason," my lord Erin replied dryly. "We can only conclude that he did it because he was raving mad." "I think I know why," Oberyn replied as he kept calculating and the others all stared at him. He sighed. "My sister Elia often wrote to my brother Doran and I towards the end, after Roriger died at the Trident and his cause collapsed. Aerys' paranoia grew terrible indeed and her letters had to be smuggled out, sewn into the clothes of those passing through Sunspear. In her last letter she spoke of how she had hidden behind a statue in a corridor after hearing the Mad King approach. She heard Aerys muttering some madness about Aryan bright flame, and how he had not gone about it all in sufficient quantities. Given what we know now." There was a pause. Erin had gone as white as parchment, as had Valerian. Merryweather looked confused however. "I don't understand," the Master of Coin said after a moment. "Aryan bright flame," said Pycelle bleakly, "better known as Aryan Targaryen, thought that by drinking wildfire he could turn himself into a dragon. Granted, he was extremely drunk at the time, but there was a tendency amongst some of the more unstable Targaryens to link wildfire with being able to transform into dragons." "Nonsense, of course. I only just put the pieces together in my head," Lord Merryweather Oberyn added as he kept calculating. "Perhaps the Mad King thought that using wildfire on King's Landing would be the blood magic sacrifice he needed to turn himself into a dragon." There was a long and horrified pause. But Merryweather seemed to be having severe trouble with the concept. "But..." Oberyn completed his calculations, raised an eyebrow for a moment and then sighed. "Do you know why I studied at the Citadel, my lords?" This time the pause was a more baffled one. Oberyn broke it. "I wanted many things there. To learn, so I could annoy the officious cunt of a maester that I grew up with at Sunspear by telling him things that I knew but he didn't. But also because I was curious about the world. And because in certain books, certain facts about the world are distilled down to their purest form. To numbers. And numbers do not lie. You cannot get a number to lie. The truth is always too self-evident. And I know what the numbers are for wildfire." The men stirred but the head pyromancer jerked upright in his chair. "No." He raised an eyebrow at the wretched little man. "What?" "The substance cannot be reduced to mere numbers. That is blasphemy. All chemical processes because that it was wildfire can be reduced to mere numbers. If you are clever enough, that is. I know that I am. You should be more concerned about why it is that your guild of lunatics made so much of the filthy stuff for the Mad King." Seaworth growled at the wretched man. "And speaking as a man from Flea Bottom, whose family used to live here, I am not particularly happy with your guild. We knew nothing of this plot." The head pyromancer wailed. "I was an acolyte at the time. We were just told to make the substance. It was Rossart who directed us at the time. He and his lieutenants." "Who all died," Seaworth said stonily. "Murdered by the Kingslayer." "No one knows." The head pyromancer was still at the wailing stage. "They just all died." "Regardless of all that," Oberyn broke in, "I know what would have happened if the Mad King had ignited the wildfire." He slid the calculations over to Pycelle, who took them with a frown. "For the Red Keep alone, that amount of wildfire, ignited at once, would have created a fireball that is called an explosion. The wildfire is located in the lowest level of the Red Keep. With nothing below it other than bedrock, there would be only one direction for the fireball to vent upwards. And the chamber it was in was built to withstand pressure from above and not pressure from below. Put simply, if a man dropped a candle in that room now we would barely feel a thing before we all died. The burning fragments of the Red Keep would fall somewhere downwind in Blackwater Bay, leaving a charred stump of bedrock. There was a strained silence that was broken by Oberyn. And if all of the wildfire in the city had been ignited? Oberyn sighed and then swapped troubled glances with Pycelle, who then slid his calculations back with a nod. The entire city would have been destroyed, Oberyn half whispered. And everyone within its walls. The smoke from the explosion would have been seen from Storm's End, perhaps as far south as Sunspear. All that would have remained of King's Landing afterwards would have been a glowing, smoking hole in the ground. And the sound of it all, it would have deafened people for leagues around. Oberyn ran a hand over his face. And the army that Ned and I led here would have all died. Tywin Lannisters too. A nod greeted those words. You all know how much we Martells mourn the death of my sister and her children. Given this plot, the odds of their survival were always a lot smaller than we ever knew. Or ever feared. I always knew that the man was mad, but this, he leant back in his chair and pulled the tattered remnants of his composure around him. This is beyond madness. He needed to write to Doran at once. This was a quarrel to the heart of the dying remnants of their plan. Then the question now becomes what we do with this wretched stuff, Valerian asked. It's like a knife to the throat of the city. Oberyn stroked his chin and then shot a look at the head pyromancer that made the man cringe in his seat. Can it be removed safely? The wretched little man started to gobble out something, but Oberyn tapped the table to silence him. Yes. But it will be difficult. Many of the barrels are leaking. The pyromancers will have to deal with those. But for the most part, given careful planning, it can be safely removed. The thing then is what to do with it. Oberyn stroked his chin and then stopped. Something had obviously occurred to him. I think I might have an idea about that. He looked at Pycelle and oddly enough Seaworth. But it will depend on if it is practical. Robert. The trees seemed to stop dead as they came to a halt, his boots digging into the snow and leaves on the ground. He had her by the wrist and she was holding him too. She looked exactly as he remembered her and no. She was a little older than the last time he had laid eyes on her in Harrenhal and there was strain in her eyes. Oh, those eyes. As he looked at her he felt his heart swell. He'd forgotten how alive she looked, what was the word, vital, yes, that was the word. Lyanna, he half whispered as he looked at her. I caught you. You're here. She looked at him almost wildly and then down at their joined hands and then she smiled at him and muttered what sounded like a prayer to the old gods. You caught me, she muttered. At last. At last, Robert. He looked her up and down. You're just as I remembered you, he said, feeling the tears in his eyes. Just as before. Lyanna smiled a very small smile. I'm dead, Robert, she said almost curtly. The dead can never age. And then she smiled the smallest and bitterest of smiles, one that faded as she looked at him. You got fat, but you look better than you used to. He blinked at that. Well, I've been doing my best to get back to fighting trim, he paused. How did you know? Oh wait, this is just a dream, isn't it? Not entirely, she said, and then something roared far off in the distance, something inhuman and bestial. It was a noise from a nightmare and the trees around them seemed to shiver in response. What the bloody hell was that? He asked as he looked in the direction that the noise had come from, but before he could step away to peer into the trees she pulled him back, her face white and her hands shaking. Robert, we don't have much time. They're looking for me. Bewildered he stared at her. Who's looking for you? She pulled a face. The others and their ally. I don't know what to call it, it's a thing that they use to hunt in places like this, between death and life. The others are hunting you. Yes, so we have very little time, she said as she looked at the trees again, a harried expression on her face. I am only here because the old gods have given me permission to talk to you. The old gods. They have brought me here. They have more power than before, but they have their limits. They cannot bring me back the way that they brought Robb back in time, but they can do this much. This made no sense, and then he looked at her, looked properly. She looked strained and nervous. Is this a dream? He had to ask the question. To his shock she shook her head and gave him that sad little smile. You're in Winterfell, Robert. I'm buried here. And Winterfell is special, the walls between the living and the dead are thinner here. He just stared at her again. Then, you're real. I mean, you're really here. It's complicated. She seemed about to explain further, when the howl started again, a little closer and this time filled with what he could tell was bottomless hate. We have no time. Robert, you need to warn Ned. The others are coming to the west. They seek to outflank the wall somehow. Ned needs to heed Mage Mormont's warning. They are using their magic to hide what they are doing, but there is danger to the west, Robert. You and Ned must watch out there. He nodded, trying to absorb her words whilst he stole a look at the trees. There was danger there, he could tell. Danger coming closer by the heartbeat. Right. Danger to the west. And then she tightened her grasp a little. You must do something else, Robert. You need to become what you were born to be. You need to be the Storm King. There's a lot more at stake than you know. Ned is becoming what he needs to be, but you need to change as well. He wanted to laugh for a moment. Be the Storm King. I keep being told that. But how? How can I do that, Lyanna? I can't call on the storm or call down lightning or cast whatever a Storm King casts. She smiled again at him, a smile of infinite sadness. You need to let go of me, Robert. The memory of me is holding you back. You're wallowing in grief. Let go of the past and step forwards. You must do this. But he shook his head. Let go of you. Never. You're my Lyanna. My she-wolf. The night of the laughing tree. I fought a war to get you back. Ned and I fought to avenge your father and your brother and to get you back from that bastard Rhaegar Targaryen. When I killed him at the Trident, when I swung my warhammer and smashed every rib of his chest in, I did it for you. I know. She almost keened the words. And I love you for it. When word came that he was dead and that you had killed him, I exulted. I threw the fact that he was dead in the face of the 3 Horsens who guarded me. And told them that they were no knights, not anymore. She closed her eyes as if in pain. They stopped being knights the first time that they held me down. So that he could. He did the only thing he could think of. He took her in his arms and hugged her. Shhhh, shush, it's all right. They are all dead. I killed Rhaegar and Ned took care of the others. They are all dead. She wept in his arms for a moment and then the thing in the trees howled yet again, startling them both, and she pushed herself out of his arms. I'm dead, she said shortly. Remember me, but let go of me, Robert. I anchor you to the past. You need to let go of me. He looked at her for a long moment, wanting to shake his head again, but knowing that he couldn't somehow. He felt almost helpless. I can try, he said eventually. I don't know if I can succeed though. Lyanna, if only you'd lived. I wanted to, she said tremulously. By the old gods, I wanted to. But those 3 fools guarding me. She looked at him again and then she wiped the tears from her eyes. There is another reason why I had to talk to you. I wanted to beg you for a life. He frowned. What? There was a short pause as she closed her eyes as if in agony, before opening them again and clenching her fists in his chest. Rhaegar, he took so much from me. He lied to me, again and again, and then he raped me. Again and again. I fought, Robert, I fought. But there were 4 of them and just 1 of me, and I lost. Fury boiled within him. I'll have their crimes added to the White Book of the Kingsguard, gods damn them. But, he gave me one thing that I do not regret. I died as a result, but I don't regret it, not when I looked at that little face in my arms. He froze. He got you with child. He did not ask the words, he just stated them, flatly. She stared at him, her face working with some undefinable emotion. Yes, she said eventually. He gave me a babe, a child of my blood. And the babe was in a way my own revenge. Rhaegar was obsessed with prophecy, the Valyrian song of ice and fire. He thought that he was an important part of it and that he needed 3 children who would be his ancestors come again. He had an Egon and a Rhaenys. He needed me to give him a Visenya. I did not. I gave him a son instead. A son, he repeated, still reeling from this. You bore him a son. My son. My blood. There's nothing of his father in him. And then to his horror she got to her knees and clutched at his breeches. Spare him. Please, I beg of you. He's no threat to you, he's not legitimate, but he's a Stark, he's my son, he's not a Targaryen. Please Robert, if you ever loved me, spare my son. He's blameless. I told Ned to protect him from your wrath. I heard about how you laughed at the sight of Rhaegar's children. I made him swear to protect him. Please, I beg you, spare him. He stood there, stunned, for a long moment, and then he reached down and pulled her up. Gods, Lyanna, please don't do that. You need never beg anything from me. Not you. Never you. I'll never have you on your knees before me. He looked into her eyes and realized that she was terrified, and a part of his heart broke for a moment. Your son will never be in any danger from me, I swear it. I will not harm him, or allow others to harm him. I swear it, Lyanna. She looked at him and then she burst into tears and hugged him. Thank you, she whispered brokenly. The dead see only short glimpses of the living. He's a good lad. He's a Stark, through and through. He hasn't had an easy life, but Ned has kept him safe. Ned. Ned knew. Oh gods. Something of that sense of shock and betrayal must have shown on his face, because Lyanna looked at him again, this time fiercely. Don't you blame Ned. I was dying, on my deathbed, when he arrived and saw my son. I made him swear to keep him safe. I made him swear to protect him. If you want to blame someone, blame me, not him. Various things clattered together in his head and formed an ugly pattern. You and Ned thought that I would have killed your son. She nodded. I was afraid. So afraid. Gods. Did people think that he was a monster? Then he thought back to that day, that terrible day when he and Ned had had that argument that ended up with Ned screaming in his face, angrier than he had ever been with him. He still had nightmares about that day. I will not hurt your son, he said again, thickly. Or have him killed. I swear it, on the old gods and the new. She looked at him again and then she smiled tremulously and ran a hand over his face. Thank you. There was a long moment of silence and then the trees to one side burst apart as a thing came through them. It was a howling dust devil, black as night. Whatever was in it was thin as a stick, had clawed hands and empty eyes and tentacles. He took a step back, before remembering himself and placing him between it and Lyanna. Whatever it was, he was glad that the wind was hiding most of it. What is that thing? He had to shout the words. The other's new ally. She replied, also shouting. It's found me. He swallowed. What will it do to you? It's too late, I've talked to you. The thing advanced slowly, the timbre of the howl changing subtly, and Robert heard noises from another part of the forest. Lyanna, what will it do to you? I'm already dead, Robert. You can't hurt the dead. He knew at once that she was lying. And that made his hands hurt for some odd reason, as if they were too hot for a moment. He looked about at the trees quickly, looking for a stick, a branch, anything that might be used as a weapon. And then movement to one side caught his eye. A thing shaped like a man strode into view. It was blue-skinned, with white hair that floated behind it like a wake, and its eyes shone like bright blue stars. The black howling thing shuddered and then drifted next to the newcomer. He swallowed and backed away from the hideous pair, escorting Lyanna away. He looked about desperately and then he blinked as one of the trees to their right seemed to shiver as a face appeared on it. What the fuck is that? Lyanna stared at it. The old gods. They are here. He paused as his hands burned again for an instant. Get to that tree, Lyanna. I'll keep them off. What with? My bare bloody hands if need be. Go. Run. She paused for a long moment and then she kissed him on the cheek and ran for it, picking up her skirts as she did. The two things approaching them stopped briefly and then darted after her. So he did the only thing he could. He ran and roared as loudly as he could, coming once again between them. John had once told him that only madmen and fools were never afraid, which was a good thing because right now he was fucking terrified. As he skidded to a halt in front of them, they both paused and eyed him, or at least the blue-skinned thing did. This was another, it had to be. "You leave her alone," he shouted after a moment of tongue-tied terror. "Leave her alone." The other stared at him and then raised its hand to backhand him. He watched the arm sweep back and then forwards, and he knew that if it touched him he was dead. His hands were burning more fiercely than ever, and he realized there and then that this was important, that this meant something. Hands, burning, why? And then suddenly something opened in his mind, something that he had no idea had even been there before, spurred by terror and desperation. Light burst from his hands, white light that annihilated shadows and which sent the two things reeling back with choked cries. He stared at his hands in astonishment and then realized that he could almost feel the shape of a sword in his hands. What was this? Was it Stormbreaker? He looked back as Lyanna reached the heart tree and then looked at him in what seemed to be astonishment. "Robert." "Lyanna, go. Go." She blinked at him and then she placed both hands on the tree and muttered something. After a moment the eyes on the tree seemed to burn with red fire and then she was gone. He turned back to the things in front of him with a savage grin. "Right, you cunts." The other eyed him balefully, something forming in its hands, like a blade being spun out of ebonite, whilst the howling thing seemed to grow in strength. He concentrated into that strange new place inside him and new light burst forth from the sword in his hands. "Go back to the shadow that awaits you." The words sounded strange in his throat and his mind, as if he was speaking in a different language. "You shall not pass." The light grew and everything seemed to shudder away from him as he suddenly thrust the sword into the earth in front of him. Fissures erupted in front of him and something gibbered and howled as the light poured out. He shuddered as he clenched his fists around the sword and then suddenly he was back in his bed, upright, covered in sweat, his heart pounding. As he ran his hands through his sweat-soaked hair he finally noticed two things. First, that Stormbreaker was on the bed with him. And the second thing was that Sabaristan Selmy was standing next to the bed, along with Okurt, both white-faced and trying not to look terrified. "What?" "Your Grace," Sabaristan said eventually. "There was light coming from your room. Bright white light. From Stormbreaker. Your Grace, it was hovering in the air, held by you. Glowing. Oh. Bugger." Now he knew how Ned felt at times. He handed Stormbreaker to Sabaristan and then got out of bed and stuck his head in the nearest bowl of water. As he scrubbed his hair clean he noticed that his hands were still shaking as if he had had an ague, but as he looked at them they shook a little less. He paused, closed his eyes and made his decision. "Sabaristan. Your Grace. My compliments to Lord Stark and tell him that I need to see him at once in the crypts, at the grave of his sister. Sir Aris. Your Grace. Once Sabaristan has escorted Lord Stark in, you are to guard the entrance and let no one in. Not a soul. Do you both understand?" "Aye, Your Grace," they chorused and then strode out. He watched them go and then sat on the bed again. All of a sudden he wanted to weep. Ned. He came awake with a start, his heart pounding. The Tower of Joy again. The fight outside and then the scream and his run inside to find his dying sister. And the baby. This time he'd found them both dead. It was a dream that he had had before. And it always made him want to sit in a corner and weep. Kat stirred in her sleep for a moment and he thanked the old gods that he hadn't woken her up. She needed her sleep. She was showing now and he'd had to talk to Sansa about taking on a little more of the burden of running Winterfell, to help her. But it was all for naught, as a heavy fist slammed against the door. "Lord Stark." It was Sabaristan's voice. "I beg your pardon, Lord Stark, but I am here on his Grace's command." Kat stirred and came awake as he stood and pulled a shirt on, before walking to the door and opening it a crack. "Sabaristan." The King's guard bowed quickly. The guard to one side did not look happy, but then Ned peered at the southerner more carefully. He looked pale and shaken. "Your pardon for the interruption at so early an hour, Lord Stark, but His Grace would like to see you immediately." Alarm went through him. "What has happened?" "A message from King's Landing." "No, my lord." Sabaristan paused and looked a little wild-eyed. It is hard to explain. But his grace is waiting for you at the grave of the Lady Lyanna Stark. This time unease went through him. Very well. Give me a moment to dress appropriately. The Kingsguard nodded tersely and Ned shut the door so that he could pull on breeches, boots and a leather jerkin. Kat looked at him as he dressed. Robert wants to see you. He muttered as he stamped his way into his right boot, which was not cooperating with his foot. And Selmy looks like he's seen a ghost. Something's up. He kissed her gently, told her to get back to sleep and then strode out of the room, with Selmy a step behind him as they passed down the corridor. What happened? For a long moment there was nothing but silence from the older man, and Ned looked over to see that his face was working as he visibly wrestled with something. We saw a light under the door to his grace's chambers, he said eventually. We were alarmed. But when we went in we saw that Stormbreaker it was Lord Stark. It was glowing. As we entered it was floating above his grace, but then he reached out and took it and it shone with light. Ned stopped walking for a moment and then stopped and stared at the Kingsguard. Truly? Sabaristan stared at him, his eyes haunted. His answering nod was heavy and stunned. Truly, my lord. The rest of their journey to the crypts was carried out in silence as Ned wondered what on earth was going on. Just before they reached the crypts something occurred to him. Sabaristan, you said that the Selmys were swordbearers to the Durandons and that you had old records sent by your brother. Are there any references to such a thing happening in the past? I will have to look at what my brother sent, Sabaristan said thoughtfully, as they reached the door. Sir Aris O'Kurt was standing there, as pale as the older Kingsguard still was, and he nodded to them as he opened the doors for them. As the doors closed behind them Sabaristan looked at him. Sir Aris will guard the entrance and will allow no one else in. I am to take you to his grace, as I was ordered to. Not knowing what else to do Ned nodded. They found Robert sitting in front of Lyanna's statue, looking up at her face. He looked as if he had gotten dressed in a hurry, his hair was wet and there was a strained look on his face. Stormbreaker was to one side, leaning against the nearest wall. As they approached he looked at them and then smiled slightly before sighing gustily. Ned. Thanks for coming. Sabaristan, I need your services for one more thing. I am at your grace's command. I need you to witness an oath I am about to swear. This startled Ned, as well as Selmy by the look of it. Of course your grace. There was a pause as Robert stood, looking at Lyanna's statue again. I, Robert of the House Baratheon, the first of my name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, do hereby swear by the old gods and the new that I will not harm the son of Lyanna Stark, nor will I allow others to harm him, or reveal that he even exists. The very air seemed to congeal around Ned as she stood there, rooted to the spot with horror. He knew that he should say something, deny something, do something, but he was so stunned that he didn't have the faintest idea what on earth he should do. And from the look on the face of Sabaristan Selmy he felt the same way. Oh bloody hells Ned, stop doing that. I am Ned Stark, statue of the North, thing that you always do when you're startled. Robert was busy sitting down again, before looking back up at Lyanna's face. Sit down. You heard my oath. And you know that I keep my oaths. Ned, sit down. After a long moment he finally coaxed his reluctant limbs into life and joined Robert on the floor before the statue. Robert. I told you that I'd been dreaming about her, Ned. Chasing her, whilst she tries to tell me something, me unable to catch her. Robert ran a shaking hand over his face. Tonight I caught her. But I don't think that it was a dream. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. What are you saying? From what she said. Ned, I think it was her. Lyanna. Her ghost, spirit, call it what you want. But it was her. I know it was her. My she-wolf. The night of the laughing tree. There was an odd startled noise from Selmy and they both looked over at the stunned Kingsguard. Your pardon, your grace, my lord, but the Lady Lyanna was the Knight of the Laughing Tree. The Mad King thought that he was some kind of plot against him. Nay, Ned said with a sad smile. She witnessed 3 squires beating a northerner that they were making fun of. She decided to teach them a lesson in the lists. Beat them all. She was a superb horsewoman. Fiery, she was, Robert agreed, looking at the statue again. She did the right thing. I would have thumped their skulls, she beat them all and made them look small. There was no plot. But I knew it was her by the way that she rode. Selmy absorbed this and then he laughed. So A's fears about that night were all for nothing. Robert said. Then he sobered. But it was her, Ned. I'm sure of it. She said that the walls between the living and the dead were thinner here in Winterfell, especially as she's buried here. And then she said 3 things. The first was a warning to you, watch the west. Something about Mage Mormont's warning and the others trying to outflank us. Mean anything to you? He thought back to Castle Black and Mage's words about freezing fogs off the frozen shore. I think so, he said thoughtfully. I'll send a raven. Then, Robert paused, his eyes moist suddenly, and Ned looked away awkwardly for a moment as his old friend wiped his eyes. Then she said that I need to be the Storm King and that to do that I have to let her go. Her memory, that is. He looked at Ned, his face almost gaunt for a moment as his nostrils flared with emotion. I don't know if I can do that, Ned. I just don't know. She said that I have to if I'm to be what's needed for this war, but after all this time. Ned pulled a face. And then he swallowed. And the third thing. Robert stared at the statue again, his eyes still red. She went down on her knees and begged me to spare the life of her son. Our Lyanna on her knees, Ned. She begged me to spare him. Gods, I think she was afraid of me. Of me, Ned. He closed his eyes tightly, but then remembered Robert's earlier vow. But you agreed. Of course I bloody did, I'm not a monster. He's your nephew, he's Lyanna's son. That trumps whatever Targaryen blood he has. He sighed and then looked at Ned. I'm not stupid, Ned. Oh, I shout and I bluster and there are times when my temper gets the better of me, but I'm getting better at it. I drink ale more than wine these days, so I'm not in my cups half the time. And while I was waiting for you I did some thinking. Jon is Lyanna's son. Don't start like that, Ned, you heard my oath. I won't hurt the boy. He looks so like you though. He sat there, his mind reeling. Gods, there had been a time when he would have been panicking by now. He'd been in fear of Robert finding out for years, and now. Robert, I couldn't tell you. Lyanna begged me on her deathbed to protect him. To save him. Save him from me. Gods, Ned, how could you think that I'd kill a child? A babe in the arms of that maid. Because you laughed at the bodies of Jon's half-siblings. You laughed, Robert. His old friend groaned and covered his eyes with one large hand for a moment. Gods, he spat bitterly. That day. That terrible fucking day. I wish I could take it all back, Ned. There've been horrible days in my life, the day that I saw my parents' ship founder right in front of me, the day that you arrived at King's Landing with Lyanna's bones, and then there's that day. The hand came down and Robert stared at the wall. Jon taught us a lot, Ned. You more than me at first, until he got it into my thick head that this was important. He taught us everything about how to be a lord. But what he couldn't teach me was how to be a king. On that bloody ride down from the Trident, after Jon prevented me from joining you in your ride to King's Landing because of my wound, all I could bloody think about was how do I act like a king, and I didn't have a bloody clue. And it didn't feel real at first. Not until I saw the Red Keep on the horizon. And then your messengers arrived and said that the Lannisters were in the city and that Tywin Lannister had turned his cloak, and all of a sudden it was all very real. Especially when I met the old lion and looked into those cold green eyes of his. In that moment I knew that he was dangerous. That I had to show no fear here, I had to be a king, I had to stand up straight in front him. So when he showed me the bodies I did the first thing that entered my head. I laughed. I knew it was a mistake the moment I saw Jon's face. Lannister was happy, but Jon wasn't. And then there was your face. When we had that argument I was angry, with myself, with the Targaryens for me being wounded, with Tywin bloody Lannister for putting me in that position, with you for being right. And afterwards, after you left in a fury, I wanted to sit on a stair and cry. Jon found me in the stable the next day, trying to saddle a horse and fucking it up because I was still injured. I wanted to ride out and join you. Apologize. Fight with you. John told me not to be a bloody fool. Said I was still injured. Said that the realm needed a king again after having a madman in charge for so long. So I stayed. I've always regretted that day, Ned. But did you really think that I would have killed Lyanna's babe? I didn't know, Robert, Ned said in some anguish. And I couldn't take the chance. My father was gone, my older brother was gone, my sister was gone, the number of Starks had halved. I had to protect the pack. He may have been half Targaryen, but he was half Stark, and that was more important. And I had to protect him from the Lannisters. If Tywin Lannister had heard that one of Rhaegar's children had survived, even as a bastard, he would have ordered his death. There was a long silence in the darkness of the crypts, with only the occasional hiss and crackle of the torches breaking that silence. Well, Robert said eventually, he's a Stark. And he's Lyanna's revenge. Eyebrows raised, Ned looked at him, and Robert laughed shortly. Lyanna said that Rhaegar wanted a daughter. Wanted a Visenya, who he presumably would have legitimized and then married to his son Aegon. Like the Conqueror, you understand. But she gave him a son instead. And he's all Stark. Looks so much like you, Ned. That's one in the eye for the shade of Rhaegar, bloody Targaryen, the raping piece of shit. Robert's eyebrows came down into a thunderous scowl. She said that he did rape her, Ned. She said that he lied and lied and lied to her, and that when that failed she had his Kingsguard hold her down, and, his voice trailed to a halt, his face red with fury. Gods damn them all for that. She was just a girl. Sworn knights against a girl. She said that she threw the fact that they were no longer knights in their faces every day after that. There was another strangled noise from Sir Barristan, and they both looked at him. He was as white as a sheet and looked as if he wanted to cry. Your pardon, your grace, my lord, he said eventually. I knew them all. Or at least I thought I did. For them to have done what they did. When Rhaegar started to get obsessed with prophecy, he changed. Became driven. He loathed his father for what he did to his mother, but to do it in turn to your sister Lord Stark, well, it is beyond me. Although in his last days his melancholy was very deep, as if he regretted everything. Especially after his second trip to the Isle of Faces. Ned's eyebrows went up again. Rhaegar went twice to the Isle of Faces. I never knew that. Why did he go there? I do not know. The Green Men said that only he could be allowed to talk to the Green Man. Afterwards he was different. Knowing what I know now, I wonder if his orders to me and the others of the Kingsguard at the Trident were designed to keep us away from him as he sought out you, your grace. I don't think that he thought he'd survive meeting you. Lyanna was happy when I told her how I'd killed him, Robert rumbled, his eyes dark with thought and memory. And there was something hunting her. I'll tell you everything later. But I need to know something first. What do you plan for John? He will be a bannerman for Robb, said Ned firmly. That's all he wants. He will found a cadet branch of House Stark, and I already have a few ideas for keeps that can be rebuilt for him. He will follow Robb should he ever call his banners. Does he know his true parentage? He does. It horrifies him. This seemed to surprise Robert. Horrifies. Ned sighed. He doesn't want anything to do with his father's family. And he hates the fact that one of his grandfathers had the other grandfather burned alive. And above all, he doesn't want to go raving mad like Aes. There was another long silence as Robert looked at him, before chuckling slightly. There is that. The Targaryen trait of going raving mad every now and then. Tell the boy that it worried me at times when I was younger. He paused. Who else knows? Cat. I had to tell her eventually. Robb, because of something else that I need to tell you about. And there's a handful of men on the wall, just in case he ever had to flee there and join the Night's Watch. Robert paused as he looked at Lyanna's statue again. It's a good plan. It'll keep him safe. Let me know if you need any coin to help. Lyanna would want him to be supported. Ned nodded. He felt slightly sick now, as the shock and adrenaline of this entire conversation burnt off. Thank you, Robert. I'm sorry for all of this. Don't be daft, Ned, Robert snorted. She told me that she made you swear on her deathbed. You did the only thing you could. You did the right thing, even though it had to be a secret. You always knew how to do the right thing. I always envied that about you, Ned. In King's Landing everything gets mired in filth and lies and self-serving cant. It's good to be here and away from all that. Never change, Ned. Please. Never change. He nodded in response, and then a yawn ripped its way out of him. Your pardon, Your Grace. It's been a hell of a night. Robert smiled. I'm sorry to get you out of bed. Get back to your cat, Ned. I'll get some sleep myself. Oh, one last thing. Lyanna said something odd. She said that the old gods were stronger than they had been, but that they had their limits and that they couldn't bring her back as they'd brought Robb. Does that mean anything to you? Oh gods. He sighed. It does. Remember your first day here, when I said that I had a source of intelligence that you wouldn't believe? It was Robb. But it's a long story and it needs Robb to be there. I'll meet you in my solar after breakfast, Robert. You need to hear it all in full. As he walked out of the crypts and out into the outside air, he looked up at the sky and the stars that blazed down. Thank you, Lyanna, he whispered. Thank you. Willers. He arrived at the gate just before sunrise, accompanied by a small group of guards. And there he waited, staring up the road to Highgarden. He was tired despite the sleep he'd had earlier, interrupted by the odd nightmare of the confrontation at the gate. He scrubbed at his face with both hands for a long moment. Too much to do. Too much to think about. Frankly, he didn't dare leave Old Town. Not if Otherbane was the only thing that could keep back whatever the seven hells that thing in the gate was. The booming was still there, like a hollow heartbeat that no one could ignore. Grandfather had quietly asked him to stay as long as he could, at least until a solution could be found. He had a feeling that such a solution would mean asking Ned Stark for help. It made him want to laugh quietly. When was the last time that the Reach had asked the North for help? Before the Field of Fire. The Andal invasion. And the arrival of the man who had sent out the call would bring its own problems. He didn't like the mood in parts of the city. Febrile was the word. Not quite unrest, but scratchy excitement and the odd bout of feverish muttering. The Starry September was still stunned by the death of the Septon, but the fact was that he did not trust the men and women in it. How many of them had ties to the faith militant? He didn't know. Which worried him. My lord. He looked up at those words. The senior guardsman was pointing up the road, and as he looked he could see the flickering of banners in that direction as a party of horsemen rode towards the gate, escorting a carriage. As they got closer he could see that the leading riders bore the banners of Highgarden, and he sighed a little and stepped forwards. The horsemen recognized him as they approached and reined in, the carriage slowing at the same time. As it came to a halt he walked forwards, acknowledging the bows of the riders and suppressing the need to wince with every muttered "my lord," before getting into the carriage, placing Otherbane to one side. Mother and grandmother were both sitting opposite him and both looked tired and strained. Willers. Mother cried, before jerking forwards and hugging him. He let her. She was red-eyed, but she always gave the best hugs, and above all she smelled of home. After a long moment she released him and went back to her seat, where she regarded him with a worried look. Are you well? Of course he's not well, he's the Lord Paramount of the Reach now, grandmother snorted. She did not hug him. If she had, that would have been worrying. Instead she gave him a wintry little smile. You have my sympathies, Willers. Now take us to him, please. He nodded and then leant out of the window. To the docks before the high tower. As he leant back in again, Mother frowned at him. Not the Starry September. No, he sighed as the carriage lurched on its way. The Starry September is being watched for signs that the faith militant have wormed their way into it. And the fact that it was the Septon of the Starry September who started all this. No, he's at the September at the high tower. It's not as big or as beautiful, but it's safe there. This earned him a harem from grandmother, who leant forwards to peer out of the window at the streets of Old Town as they rolled down the street. Your message was terse. What exactly happened? He hadn't been looking forwards to this, and the uncertainty must have shown on his face, but oddly enough it was Mother who commanded him, tell us, Willers. Tell us what happened. So he sighed and then he did. Everything. The argument at the high tower, how the Septon had been allowed admittance, Father's embarrassment, the descent to the gate and then what had happened there. And then father's last moments. By the time he finished, grandmother had squeezed her eyes closed and mother had both hands at her mouth as she wept silently. He sat there awkwardly, not knowing what to do or to say. The silence stretched on until the carriage shuddered to a halt. "The docks, my lord," a guard said as he opened the door. "Lord Hightower has sent his personal barge." Willers nodded as he retrieved the ancient spear, got out and then helped the two women to exit the coach. As mother got out she wiped her eyes one last time and then schooled her features as befitted Lady Tyrell. Grandmother eyed her for a moment, nodded curtly and then they all boarded the barge. As the oarsman stretched out for the Hightower he settled other Bane in its leather holder at his back and then mentally prepared himself. He was not looking forward to this. Going anywhere near the gate brought back unpleasant memories and he was truly worried about what it all meant. Garland and Laura's were still standing vigil in the September when they arrived at it. They both looked up and then went to mother at once, who hugged them both before looking at the lonely figure on the bier in front of them all. Mother strode up to the bier with grandmother and then looked at father's body. He had been dressed in fine robes rather than in his armor, which was a good thing as he would have looked scrawny in it. He's so thin, mother whispered as she stroked father's face gently. How could that have happened? It was the thing behind the gate, mother said. Laura's, a haunted look on his face. Confronting it, took its toll on father. Mother nodded slowly as she just stood there, looking at the body of her husband, before taking his hand and lifting it to her cheek for one last time. And then she sat in the chair that Garland had brought over for her. As for grandmother, she stood on the other side of the bier looking down at her son for a long moment, before she leant down and kissed his forehead. My poor dear boy, she whispered just loud enough for Willers to hear. Rest in peace. Sleep until the morning comes. Willers stood there, his mind filled with memories for a long moment. And then grandmother straightened up, smoothed father's hair a little and then made her way over to Willers. Right, she said firmly. Show me this bloody gate thing that killed my brave but foolish son. Grandmother Laura's was foolish enough to say, it's dangerous, and grandmother silenced him with a glare and then looked back at Willers. Show me. He opened his mouth, say the gimlet look in her eyes, shut his mouth and then held out his arm so that she could hold it as he led her out of the September and off to the stairway that went downwards. As they descended she looked at him briefly. And how are you, Willers? You are now Lord of the Reach and I know that it can be a heavy burden at times. It was a good question and he sighed as he thought about it. I'm tempted to say ask me again in a week, but that would be the wrong thing to say. It's been hard, grandmother. There's a lot to do. And now with all this. She harumphed as they started down the next flight of stairs carefully. Has the blizzard of ravens started to arrive yet with messages from lords with available daughters? Oh yes, Willers smiled as they reached the bottom and then headed for the Black Steps. Lord Hewitt has sent several ravens already with suggestions about his various daughters, and that's going to just be the start of it. It is earned. Grandmother paused and looked down at the steps. Who made these steps? No one knows, he said grimly. The bottom course of the high tower is all made from this stone. Yes, but the steps are made for feet smaller than ours. Then she stiffened. Ah. I think I feel it. They continued down to the bottom of the stairs and then along to the doors, where guards with sweat on their foreheads seemed to relax slightly at the sight of Willers and other Bane. At a nod from him they opened the doors and they passed through until eventually they were standing before the gate, which was booming at its usual rate. Grandmother hissed with some undefinable emotion the moment that she laid eyes on it, and she now stared at it with narrowed eyes and a mouth set in a grim line. So that's it, she said eventually. The thing that killed your father. Yes, he sighed. And it worries the life out of me. Grandfather too. She took a step forwards and squinted at it, before waving her walking stick at the frame. What do those runes say? We don't know. I've had maesters from the Citadel here and Samwell Tarly is researching it as a part of his task of finding out more about the early history of the Reach. Grandmother harumphed again. It still amuses me that Randall Tarly, a man who revels in hitting other men on the head until their brains ooze out of their ears, has a son who knows what a book looks like. She looked at the flagstones in front of the gate. So where did your father rescue this fool of a Septon? Just beyond the marker there, he replied, pointing. and just beyond that was where I killed the Septon of the Starry September. Or his corpse at least. Grandmother shivered a little. Walking Dead. A touch of the north this far south. Chilling. And you said that the, whatever it is behind the gate was afraid of you. I was holding other bane, grandmother. I think that it was afraid of the weapon, not me. Another harumph. Perhaps. Perhaps. Do you know what it is? And the booming noise. He eyed the gate. I have a suspicion, he muttered in a low voice. But it's best not discussed here. Grandmother stared at him quizzically, and then she paled slightly and stole a glance at the gate, where the booming was still filling the air. You think it can hear us? Best not to take the chance, Willers replied, before leading her back out of the room, giving it one last glare over his shoulder as they left the room. Going up took longer than going down, especially as grandmother was tiring. But eventually he ushered her into grandfather's solar, where there was a pitcher of wine, some glasses and some honeycakes waiting, as well as grandfather himself and Aunt Mallory. Larry mentioned that you went to see the gate, Olena, so you might need some wine after that, grandfather said as he poured some wine into a glass and then handed it over. I'm sorry about Mace, but by all the gods, why did he have to allow that idiot access to the gate? Grandmother took a sip of wine, mumbled at a honey cake and then pierced the Lord of the High Tower with her gimlet gaze. And why, she snapped, did you allow it all in the first place? Why did you not tell them all that it was none of their business? That brought her a wince and a sigh. Frankly, I hoped that they'd leave after becoming properly afraid of it, he said, pouring wine for them all. It terrifies most people. I didn't realize that Septon Alliston was so set on raising his profile in the faith that he would try and get that close to it. I'm just sorry that Mace died saving a man who was already dying. There was a moment of silence and then grandmother nodded reluctantly and drank some more wine. Very well. Understandable. Now earlier, downstairs, Willers would not tell me what you think the thing behind the gate is. Willers swapped a glance with his grandfather and aunt for a moment before leaning forwards. Grandmother, based on what I saw at the gate and above all from what father said just before he died, I think that the drowned god is behind the gate. Grandmother just stared at him and he realized that for the first time in his experience she was astonished. The drowned god, she said eventually. Willers, my boy, are you feeling all right? I am fine, grandmother. But father said that what was behind the gate was dead but would not die. And that it was a god. Does any of that sound familiar? The Ironborn doggerel, grandmother breathed. But that's. It would explain why the Ironborn are so obsessed with Old Town, even though they don't know why, Mallory said as she stared at the books on the table to one side. It also explains why House Hightower has always been so focused on the Hightower itself and keeping it safe. Hold the Hightower, my father told me on his deathbed, grandfather muttered savagely. He never said why. Just hold the Hightower and protect the gate and nothing bloody else. He all but threw some wine down his throat and then stood up and walked over to the table. All these books left by my ancestors. Books that talk of magic. Books of so-called spells. Nothing about the history of this place. Nothing about what might be required to fight a bloody god. Damn my ancestors. Damn them. Willers and the others stared at grandfather for a long moment, until he rubbed his forehead and waved at them all in apology. Your pardon. I just hope that something is found in the citadel. We need information. If this is indeed the drowned god, we will have to send word to Winterfell and ask Ned Stark to come here. Willers sighed. He caught grandmother's questioning look. Before he died, father said that what was behind the gate was afraid of Ned Stark's fist or something like that. The Fist of Winter. Grandmother sat up in her chair. Ned Stark has found the hereditary weapon of the old kings of winter in Winterfell, called the Fist of Winter. If it's anything like other bane, I'll write to Lord Stark at once, Willers muttered. If he's the one thing that whatever it is behind the gate fears, then we need him. He might have more pressing things to deal with, Mallory sighed. Everyone who heard the call is heading north. Ned Stark was last heard of at the wall. Well, who knows where he is now? Or what he's dealing with? I'll write to him. Grandfather, I'll need 2 ravens for identical messages, which I'll sign myself. Willers said forcibly. In the meantime I must stay here, at the High Tower. If other bane is the only thing that can keep the thing behind the gate at bay, then here I stay. Besides, I want to be here to keep an eye on the starry September. We can't let the faith militant get a hold there. Grandmother swapped a gaze with grandfather, and then they both nodded and muttered good virtually in unison, before grandmother pulled a slight face. Your father will have to be buried in High Garden as soon as possible. Your absence will be noted. He shrugged in response. It can't be helped. Garland will preside over father's funeral. I'll pay my respects later. There was a pause as everyone seemed to absorb this, broken by a hurried knock on the door. Enter. Grandfather snapped, and the door opened to reveal a somewhat rattled Maester. My lords, a raven from King's Landing brought this. He handed the note over to grandfather, who read it with what seemed to be rapidly mounting astonishment. Good gods, grandfather said eventually and rather faintly. News from Winterfell. His Grace the King has divorced his wife after she was discovered in, fornication with her own brother, the Kingslayer. Joffrey, Tommen and Myrcella Baratheon are now all hills after being declared bastards born of incest. There was a very long moment of silence as everyone stared at him, and then everyone bar grandmother seemed to stand up and stare at the message in astonishment. Well, said grandmother eventually. Thank the gods your father is dead. As otherwise he'd immediately be plotting to throw Margaery into the arms of Robert Baratheon. And then she grinned fiercely. Oh, how the old lion must be raging. Chapter 40. Chapter text. Bronn. He often wondered what the spiders in the crypts ate. There had to be some kind of food down here. He thought about that and then shuddered. Well, the tombs of the more recently dead Corlishs were sealed. He walked down the passageway, looking into the rooms to each side. Yes, all crypts. Good stonework. Solid. Excellent. He passed on, looking at the tombs with a little more interest. Old statues of old, long-dead lords stared back at him, swords on their laps. Or what remained of swords at times, some little more than rusty shards. And then he paused and stared. Interesting. Some of the coats of arms on the earlier tombs were interesting. He continued on, looking about. More good stonework, nothing bricked up, excellent. He tilted his head at the statue that had not just a rusty smear but also an old dust-covered shield. Lord Castle. He paused and looked behind him. Steward Corlish. He wanted to call her Ursula, but he knew that she was not yet ready for any familiarity. Yet. Can I ask why you are in the crypts? Oh, just having a look around. For what? Weak spots. In the crypts. She deployed a raised eyebrow at him. Ah. He looked at her. Every keep has a weak spot. Every one. It might be the old wall that the previous lord didn't get around to replacing or strengthening. It might be the Saliport that didn't get a new gate, as had been planned. He paused and then grinned at her. Ever heard of House Hunefeather, in the Reach? Ursula Corlish blinked. No, my lord. Don't blame you. Small house. Small keep. And not so much Hunefeather by name, more like Pisanville by nature. A secure keep though. Locked up tighter than a drum. A sellsword was once hired to retrieve a Valyrian steel dagger from that keep, as it was said by another local lord that they didn't really own it. The sellsword spent 4 days inspecting the bloody place from all angles. Finally he discovered an old disused privy hole overhanging a cliff. And it's amazing what a well-motivated man with a rope and a grappling hook can do. There was a pause and then she raised an eyebrow at him. Was that sellsword you? Yes. Another pause. A disused privy hole. Yes. She lowered the eyebrow. So you're looking for weak spots? I am. He looked around. Seen 1 or 2 places to keep an eye on. Nothing bad, mind you, but I'm just checking the last areas. She looked at the tombs. Anything here? No, he tilted his head. The stonework down here is the work of the first men. And I didn't know that the Corlishs once married into the Muds. Was this place once a part of the Riverlands? A long time ago, she replied softly as she looked at the nearest statue. The Vale and the Riverlands used to fight over it. And yes, one of my ancestors, no, 2 of them married into the Muds. A very long time ago. They stood there for a moment amidst the long dead Corlishs before he looked at her. Was there a reason why you came looking for me? A raven came from King's Landing. It seems that King Robert has divorced Cersei Lannister, on a charge of incestuous coupling with her own brother. And the royal children have all been disinherited. They are all bastards. A weight he hadn't known was on him fell off his shoulders. So, the news is out there. It is. Good thing I was down here. You can tell people that I was very surprised when you told me. I hope that you were yourself surprised. The other eyebrow flickered. Oh, astonished. Good. He pulled a slight face. Any word from Hayster about Lady Lysa, whatever the hell's her name is now? Arryn. Tully. She went slightly pink and her chin went up. Oh dear. Not a good sign. Still demanding things that she has no right to. Well, as soon as she's fit I want her out of here. Out and off to King's Landing or the Eyrie. Away from here. That woman's raving mad and I still think that she's a threat to us. When he looked at her again, Ursula Corlish had a rather odd look on her face. I agree, Lord Castle. Yes, there was definitely something there. He could work with that. Kevan. The ride east from Torrens Square was hard. Tywine drove the men at a fearsome pace, in a way that reminded him of the days that led to the fall of the Rains and the Tarbecks. And that was something that frightened him more than a bit. His brother could be as relentless as an avalanche when sufficiently enraged. And Tywine was indeed enraged, but coldly so. Tywine was even more dangerous in circumstances such as these. When they stopped for the first night at a small keep that had a particularly young, and terrified, lord, the first thing that he checked was if there had been any further news from Winterfell. To his relief there was not. No news of executions, no word of exiles, nothing. Tywine was curt with everyone, even him, and the men trod lightly around him, even Kevan himself. He knew what kind of things might set his brother off, so he warned the officers and the men and drove himself just as hard to keep on top of any little hiccups. He had already warned Gregor Bloody Clegane not to do anything stupid. He'd then warned several large guards to keep an eye on the wretched man. Tywine regarded him as a tool, if a very blunt one. Kevan viewed him as an unstable murdersome idiot, and he still didn't know why his brother had brought him with them, other than to show that he commanded the loyalties of the mountain. East they rode again at dawn on the second day, passing along the road that ran through the hills to the north of the Barrowlands. Every settlement around them seemed to be busy sowing or tending to crops, and he viewed it all with a growing sense of dread. There also seemed to be some fairly intense efforts at breeding livestock in places, with sheep herders standing back from the road to let them pass. Some of them were quite winsome women, but he didn't have to snarl at the men to stop them from stopping to talk to them. Tywine's wintry gaze was enough, cowing even the mountain. On they rode, walking the horses when they were blown, but still pressing on. He doubted that anyone else could keep that kind of pace, not even Robert Baratheon himself. The first surprise was when they came across an old keep that had once been all but a ruin, but now there was a group of tents to one side and a building had been restored, with more on the way. The banner that flew was that of a running black direwolf on a red background, and Tywine had been curious enough to ask whose keep it was as they ate their midday meal just after the mountain had been stopped from trying to headbutt a tree to stop one of his headaches. The man who strode up to them, guards behind him, was tanned and looked vaguely familiar. Lord Rickard Redstark was his name, and he told them he was restoring what had been one of his family's old holdfasts as his own. House Redstark. Tywine had not quite scoffed. That family has been gone from the north for centuries. Not since, and then he had paled a little, which for Tywine was unusual. Not since the conquest. The king who knelt was also the king who sent members of important families east to Essos, in the company of the Rose. Just in case. Cousin Ned can tell you more, but we have come home to fight the others. Safe trip, Lord Lannister. And then he strode off again. Kevan watched the man leave and then ordered that the camp be struck as soon as the men had finished eating. True enough, Tywine ordered them back on the road soon after, his face as hard as stone. As they resumed their ride east, he overheard Tywine mutter something that made dread run through him. 4 words, something dark is coming. He had a bad feeling that more surprises were on the way. Robb. By the time he finished speaking, the two men in front of him were both white-faced and gaping at him. The fact that they were the two most powerful and important men in all of Westeros was amusing in no small way. He kept that to himself, however. Best not to stir anything up. After a long moment, Robert Baratheon sank back into his chair, which creaked a little in protest, and then looked at him and smiled crookedly. "Gods, no wonder the old gods sent you back, lad. Me dead, Ned dead, half the realm on fire and the other half getting ready to go to war, and all the time the threat of the others was hanging almost unseen over the wall. No call. Gods. What a fucking mess." "And Joffrey on the Iron Throne," muttered Stannis, his voice hoarse. "And Renly, gods. Renly dead from foul magic." Robb eyed the man carefully. "My mother saw his death and described the thing that killed him. She described it to me afterwards." Stannis ran a shaking hand over his face. "Renly. I gave him my food at the siege of Storm's End to keep him alive. And he repaid me with betrayal. In a world that is no more. A time, I mean. Gods, this is making my head spin." "How did you cope with it, Ned?" "Badly, at first," father replied from the window, where he had been staring out at the courtyard below, his hands behind his back. "It's always hard to hear Robb tell of what happened. A shadow with my face." Stannis shuddered, before catching himself. "I will give orders that if this Melisandre of Ashai appears anywhere near my family or the court, she is to be killed at once." The king pulled a slight face at this, but then looked back at Robb. "The Greyjoy boy knows about this, doesn't he?" It was a surprisingly shrewd query, and Robb nodded after a moment. "And that's why he wants to change his name?" Another nod. There was a long moment, and then the king let out a bark of laughter. "If I didn't know better, you've had your revenge for that other future, Ned." Father turned and quirked an eyebrow at him. "What's that?" "Roose Bolton's true-born son is to marry your daughter and renounce his family's legacy. That fool Balon Greyjoy is about to have his last son take a new name, and Jaime Lannister has taken the black. It only needs Walder Free to fall over and break his scrawny neck to complete it all." Father smiled slightly. "I wish that I planned such a revenge. But I did not. You know why I did not tell you of all this when you arrived now? You wouldn't have believed me." The king rumbled, "I would not." Then he looked at the door. "Sir Barristan." The door opened to reveal the white-cloaked warrior. "Your Grace. Is Theon Greyjoy out there?" "He is, Your Grace." "Send him in, if you please." Your Grace." When Theon entered, there was a look on his face that reminded Robb of those men who had gone into battle for the first time. His chin was up, but there was something in his eyes that combined many emotions: hope, a little fear, some uncertainty, but also resolve. He stood in front of the king, Mist at his side, and bowed. "Your Grace. You are here again to ask permission to change your name to that of Theon Greymist." Theon swallowed. "I am, Your Grace. I wish to found my own house here in the north, as a bannerman to House Stark. You are aware of the implications of this?" "I am." The king looked at Robb for a moment. "Young Robb here has recounted the future that he remembers. I understand why you have made this request now." Theon's eyes jerked rapidly to Robb and then back to Robert Baratheon, before he nodded jerkily, a sheen of sweat suddenly on his forehead. Mist looked up at him for a moment, before making a huff noise that seemed to reassure Theon. "I want nothing to do with my father, Your Grace. When he rebuilt the Iron Fleet, he placed my life in danger the moment the first hull was laid down. He cares nothing of me. I care nothing of him. Lord Stark has been a far better father to me than my flesh and blood. I am of the North now." And then he fell silent, flushing slightly as if with embarrassment at how many words had escaped his mouth. The king looked at him for a long moment from beneath a pair of beetling eyebrows, before finally making a decision. "Theon Greyjoy, bend the knee before me." Theon went down one knee at once, visibly trembling just a bit. There was a long moment, and then the king said, "Rise, Theon Greymist. You will have to swear your vows to Lord Stark, but from this moment you have founded a new lordly house here in the north. Do you have any idea of what banner you will fly in your keep, wherever it will be?" Theon stood, shaking slightly with emotion, before pulling out a piece of cloth with a coat of arms stitched onto it. The king took it. A blue wolf running over green waves under a grey sky. There was an odd noise from farther behind him, and he half turned to see the Lord of the North deep in thought. A good choice, the king rumbled. Any words yet? Theon shook his head, obviously overwhelmed. Very well then. Talk to Lord Stark in a bit. But for the meantime, that's all. Off with you. Theon looked at Robb, mouthed ale at him and then walked off looking happy but dazed. As the door closed behind him, father rubbed his nose. Interesting banner, he muttered, and then something under his breath. Who else knows about this? Robert Baratheon rumbled. Cat. I, her and John. Lewin too. Gia Mormont. And a few others at the wall, Benjen and Maester Aemon. Oh, and Tyrion Lannister, who worked out certain clues. And now us. Let's keep it to that. Too many more, and who knows what might happen. Father nodded and looked out of the window again. And now we await Tywin Lannister. The king nodded, a scowl on his face, but just as he seemed about to say something there was a rumble of voices in the corridor, before the door opened to reveal Sir Barristan again. Your pardon, your grace, but there is a lord from the Reach who craves an urgent audience with you. Who is it? Lord Randall Tarly, your grace. The king's eyebrows flew upwards. Then he swapped a gaze with Stannis, who looked as if his eyes had turned to agate gems, before sighing and then looking at the door. Tarly. Get in here, you old warhorse. A lean bald man with a grey beard strode in, dressed in travel-stained clothes, strode in and took a knee in front of the king. Your grace. Stand. You've come a long way. The call. Lord Tarly went pale for a moment as he stood. It was loud at Horn Hill, your grace, he muttered, and Robb could see the others prick up their ears. Loud enough that, well, my oldest son heard it more than I did. And he found other bane, the spear of the Gardener Kings, hidden at Horn Hill. Lord Willers Tyrell holds it now. And he sent me, your grace. The call has been sent out and the Reach will answer. As I have some small knowledge of war, Lord Willers sent me to find out what exactly the threat is and what the Reach needs to send most urgently. Robb raised his eyebrows and then saw the others react as well. Other bane. The bald man looked at him and he nodded at him. Robb Stark, Lord Tarly. My father holds the Fist of Winter, and his grace holds Stormbreaker, both weapons of the first men. Sit down, Tarly, the king muttered. And tell us all that has happened in the Reach. Theon. He sat on the bench in the courtyard, next to the table and small cask of ale, and stared at the mug in his hand. He felt, oddly numb. He had thought that he'd be feeling exultant, and there was a shade of that in the back of his head, but for the most part there was this shocked stillness in his head. There was still no sign of Robb, but mist was staring at the doorway in a way that made him feel that he and Grey Wind would join them soon. He was no longer a Greyjoy. Instead he was a Grey Mist, the first of his name. He had a better idea of what he was feeling now. Part anticipation about the road ahead, part exultation about his new freedom. He was no longer a hostage to his father's madness, and part fear about failing. His new house would be based on him. Him. Was he strong enough? He was sure that he was, but there was that nagging feeling. Normally he could look back on the fact that he had been a Greyjoy and take fresh strength from that. Not anymore. Are you all right, lad? Sir Roderick Castle was looking down at him quizzically. You've been staring at that ale for quite a while. He paused and then drank some of his ale. I'm no longer Theon Greyjoy anymore. His Grace has given me permission to found my own house now. A northern house. I am now Theon Greymist. The elder Castle stared at him for a moment, his eyes widening a little, before the old man smiled and slapped him on the back. Congratulations, lad. Or should I say Lord Greymist? I think it is Lord Greymist, said a voice to one side, and he turned to see Robb approach, Grey Wind next to him. Mist waffled a greeting at his sibling and then the two direwolves sat and stared at them. Robb poured himself a mug of ale, nodded at Sir Roderick to do the same and then held his drink up in a salute. To Lord Greymist. The newest bannerman to House Stark. As they all saluted and drank, Theon felt the shock of it all lessen a little. It had happened. He had stepped out of the shadow of Balon Greyjoy. It should have been that moment in his life when the sun broke through the clouds. Instead it started to rain gently, a shower that spattered down onto the shingles on the half-roof above their heads. But they were dry enough where they were, and as they finished the mugs he showed the older man his idea for a sigil. Sir Roderick peered and nodded approvingly. "Any word on where you'd have your keep?" He shrugged. "Near the coast perhaps. I always wondered about founding a northern navy on the western coast." He felt his nostrils flare a bit. "Protect the coast from the Ironborn." Sir Roderick gazed at him keenly for a moment before nodding sharply. "A good idea," he grunted. "Another thumb in the eye of your father." Robb looked at the white-whiskered master of arms. "Did you ever meet Balon Greyjoy?" "Saw him once," was the reply. "After Pike fell. Man had a face that looked as if he'd eaten a vinegar-soaked rotten onion." He seemed to be about to say something else when all of a sudden there was a shout from the east gate, followed by a horn being blown. The older Castle put his ale down and hurried out into the rain, looking up at the gates, where his nephew was standing with a Mirish spyglass in hand. Theon swapped a troubled look with Robb and they both followed the older man, having tugged up the hoods of their cloaks, with their direwolves padding gravely after them. After a moment a guard ran out towards Sir Roderick. "A party on the road," he gasped. "Bearing the banner of House Harlaw. Ironborn." Castle barked and Theon felt his eyebrows fly up. What was the reader doing here? "How many?" Robb asked, his eyes keen. "Just a half-dozen of them, my lord." Robb looked at Theon, who pulled a face. "Not many." His felt his face harden. "Watch them and find out why they're here." His friend nodded. "Admit them, but watch them," as Lord Greymist said. As Sir Roderick and the guard hurried off, Robb looked at him. "Are you ready for this?" "Not really," but he set his chin. "I'll need to be." The party that rode through the gates were indeed Ironborn because they rode as if they were sacks of straw. Not one was a good horseman, but two were slightly better than the others. The first was an old man bearing the banner of House Harlaw, a white scythe on a black background. The second was more interesting, a girl in her mid-20s, dressed in dark leathers, with short black hair and a nose that was rather impressive. Rather familiar as well. As the assorted group dismounted, one muttering that he needed a new ass, the two Castles walked up to them. "What is your business in Winterfell?" The girl drew herself up. "I am Asha Greyjoy, here bearing a message from Lord Roderick Harlaw, of Harlaw, for his Grace King Robert." Then she paused and exchanged a quick glance with the man with the banner, who nodded fiercely at her. "And we have heard the call." So, it was Asha after all. He thought it was her, although his memories of his sister were hazy with age. He put a hand on Mist's head for a moment and then frowned a little. How would this play out? The Castles both turned to look at Robb, and it was only then that the Ironborn seemed to notice them and the direwolves. Several of them muttered at each other, whilst Asha raised a rain-soaked eyebrow at them. "Lord Robb, this is Asha Greyjoy," Sir Roderick rumbled. "And party." He glared at the other Ironborn in such a way that made them stir uneasily. Robb tilted his head as he looked at the Ironborn and then he looked at Theon. "Lord Greymist," he said quietly, "would you help me escort Lady Greyjoy to his Grace the King?" He nodded. He wanted to grin, but somehow this felt right. I would." His sister seemed to dismiss him with a glance, albeit a troubled one because of Mist, before almost openly eyeing Robb's ass as he led them towards the Great Keep. He had a feeling that his sister might have a few shocks coming to her. Edmure. It was a mercy to execute the mad Septon Blackfoot. As he was dragged to the place that had been chosen to execute him, it was obvious that he was still raving mad, drooling and laughing as he cried at something that no one else could see. The men were subdued as they watched him approach, and he could understand why. He was completely insane and could not understand that justice was being done. Did he even realize that he had committed crimes that warranted the death penalty? Blackfoot was dragged to the spot in front of him and he straightened and did his best not to swallow with nerves. This had to be done. His good brother always said that the man who pronounced the sentence should also be the man who swung the sword. The sword in question was being held by Patrick Mallister, newly returned from Seaguard and oddly quiet. He'd said that his father was marshalling aid for the wall with all dispatch and that the call had been heard at Seaguard. He really needed to talk to Ned. Patrick held out the sword, which had been sharpened especially for this, and he took it. It was heavy. That was a good thing. Kneel, he commanded. Blackfoot just stood there in front of the block, laughing softly and crying at the same time. There was also that sudden stink about him that made Edmure wrinkle his nose in disgust, and he pulled a face and nodded at the guards, who forced the Septon to his knees without much difficulty. In the name of Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm, I, Edmure of the House Tully, son of Lord Hoster Tully of Riverrun, Lord of the Riverlands, sentence you to die. If you have any last words, now is the time. The Septon did not say a word, he just hummed and smiled and cried. Edmure looked at Patrek for a moment, who grimaced, and then sighed. Very well. But as he lifted the sword in the air and prepared to swing it, the Septon actually finally said something. Can you hear it? He paused, confused. Hear what? There was a pause. They come. The Septon said the words in a wondering tone. They are coming. I hear them. I hear him. Faint. So faint. He's coming. The giggle turned into a sob. Kill me. He stared at the man and then hefted the sword again, gauging where to strike on the man's skinny neck. And then he brought it down, as hard and true as he could. The impact jarred his wrists, but he had judged it right, and he panted a little as he stepped back from the headless corpse. The head itself rolled on the ground for a moment, before coming to a stop, the eyes twitching once, twice, and then ceasing to move as they went dull with death. There was a collective sigh from all the men around him, and he looked up to the balcony to one side where father was standing, watching it all. Hoster Tully gave his son a single firm nod and then walked tiredly back into the hall. Edmure looked at the nearest guards. Give his body to the Silent Sisters. He served the Seven, before his ambition doomed him, so treat his body with due respect. The men nodded and then bent to their work, and as they did, Patrek approached and took the sword from him. Normally, his old friend said, we would go out now and find wine and wenches and forget the cares of the world. What do you think he meant by his last words? He remembered the sensation of metal meeting flesh and bone, and shuddered. I don't know, he said carefully. But wine sounds like a good idea to me at the moment. Asher. Winterfell felt intimidating. Not that she would ever admit that to anyone. No, she made herself walk as normally as possible, perhaps with a suggestion of swagger. Anything to prevent anyone from suggesting that this place made her uneasy. The direwolves really made her skin crawl a bit though. There was something about them, something serious, for want of a better word. Every now and then one of them would look at her in such a way that made her feel very odd indeed. The two young men leading her deeper into Winterfell also made her think a bit. Lord Robb had to be Robert Stark, Ned Stark's heir. He took after his Tully mother, and although he was young he looked as if he was old enough for a tumble or two. Nice ass too. But there was something about his eyes that looked a bit strange, as if his eyes were older than his face. As for the other lad, he hadn't taken his hood down when they went indoors, unlike Robb Stark, and there was something odd about him as well. He had a direwolf, but his name was Greymist and not Stark, and she had thought that only Starks could have direwolves. Perhaps he was Ned Stark's bastard son with a new name. She shook her mind off the men and concentrated on where they were going. They had entered a doorway and were heading up a set of stairs that doubled back on itself as it went upwards, and then along a long corridor. Up another set of stairs and then another corridor that led to a closed door that was guarded by a white-haired man in armor with a white cloak. Sir Barristan, Robb Stark said with a respectful nod of greeting. We need to see his grace at once. This is Asher Greyjoy, with a letter from Lord Harlaw. The old Kingsguard nodded at the Stark boy and then looked at her, with a slight tilt of the head and a narrowing of the eyes that made her suddenly aware that this man was dangerous in a way that she had seldom seen before. One moment, Sir Barristan muttered, before knocking on the door and slipping in. When he returned he nodded. His grace is within. The room was obviously Lord Stark's solar, judging from the maps on the walls. But it was the four men within it that made her swallow. She remembered them from after Pike had fallen, and after that, for a while, three of them had appeared in her nightmares. Stannis Baratheon, the man who had smashed the Iron Fleet at Fair Isle. Ned Stark, the quiet wolf who had besieged the castle, and finally Robert Baratheon, the demon of the Trident himself. And then there was Randyll Tarly, the grim lord of Hornhill and the man who had carved a bloody swathe of his own through the Iron Islands during Father's ill-fated rebellion. Tali was standing in front of the largest map, staring up at it, and was pale. As she entered she heard the words 100,000 fall from his lips, and then he seemed to catch himself and rally. As for Robert Baratheon, he was not what she thought he would be. She remembered the demon, but had been told by Ironborn merchants who had passed through King's Landing that the king had gone spectacularly to seed in recent years. Well, those merchants must have been wrong, because the king looked as powerful as ever.